Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ashen Souls, Fallen Hearts in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 26, The Road Ahead. After Shahid and the rest of his forces were finally sent back to their side of the border, Claude had to force himself to walk back to the central part of the fortress on the Fodlan half of the locket. His legs were killing him, and he felt as if he was going to collapse on the stone ground at any given moment, but he couldn't let it show. He was alive, and that had to count for something. He had been through worse situations than this. Not that it did anything to help just how miserable he felt at the moment though. Over the minutes that followed Claude's arrival, the rest of the Golden Deer also made their way back to the main stronghold. Holst was among them, and he was clearly in the best mood of the group. Holst and Hilda wound up stepping aside to talk quietly to one another, no doubt about just how worse for wear Hilda had come to look over the course of the fight. Claude could already tell that he wasn't going to hear the end of her complaints on the way back to the monastery, not that it was at all surprising given the circumstances. At the very least, the rest of the Golden Deer were in an appropriately chipper mood. Even Lawrence didn't seem to have anything bad to say, and he smiled brightly as he glanced around at the rest of the group. "We did it. We won. We held the locket," he exclaimed. Claude could tell Lawrence was still riding the high of getting out of the fight in one piece, and he wished he had been able to do the same. Unfortunately, the number of Almiran Wyvern riders out for his royal blood had made sure that ship sailed ages ago. Claude admired Lawrence's optimism, at least, even if he couldn't bring himself to mirror it. "Honestly, I expected more of a struggle," Ignatz murmured. He realized a moment later just how bad that sounded, and his cheeks went bright red with embarrassment. I mean, it was a difficult fight, and it was definitely hard, but I thought the Almirans would be even harder to defeat than they were. I came in here thinking they were going to try and wipe the floor with us, but for some reason, the Almirans just didn't have the fight in them. If they were serious about beating us, we probably would have found our backs against the wall," Lysathea finished for him, gladly explaining that which Ignatz couldn't figure out how to put to words. "If they really wanted to win this fight, then we would have lost even before their commanders appeared. Instead, they're back on their side of the border, and we're all still in one piece. What matters is that we're safe, and no one from our house was killed," Marianne pointed out, her voice wavering slightly at the constant talk of violence and how horribly the battle could have so easily ended. "We're okay now. That's what matters most." She seemed to be reassuring herself more than anyone else, though upon closer examination, that made a lot of sense. Marianne needed all the encouragement she could get, whether she wanted to admit it or not, and sometimes, that meant she turned inward for the support she needed. Raphael, on the other hand, was bold and chipper about everything that had happened. He still had a surprising amount of energy, and Claude couldn't help but stare at him in muted surprise. Or, at the very least, he would have if he hadn't been going out of his way to try and hide his shock from the rest of his house. Even so, Raphael remained unbothered. Thanks to Holst. He was out there taking on thousands of soldiers all by himself. He cried out. "I don't think it was actually thousands, although I agree it was an impressive sight," Leonie nodded. "We should really be glad he was able to take care of one of their commanders. I doubt we would have stood much of a chance if we had to fight against two leaders from the enemy army at the same time. Holst made our jobs manageable. And that's something we should all aspire to." Speaking of Holst, Claude turned to look over in the direction of the heir of House Goneril. He was still talking with Hilda nearby as the younger sibling of the two tried to pull a few stray stones from her hair. The rocks had likely wound up on her head thanks to the winds the Wyvern riders picked up, and given that she was fighting on the outer edge of the fortress, it was just a matter of time before she wound up with some debris to contend with. She wasn't happy about it though, and her face had been set in a pout ever since she turned her attention to pulling the pebbles out of her tresses. Claude took that sight as his cue to stroll over to where Holst and Hilda were standing, and the two siblings went quiet before turning their attention in his direction. "Kind of nuts to think the Almiran prince personally led their army against us," Claude started. He had many other descriptors he would have preferred to use for Shahid's behavior, but for the time being, he decided to start off small and tame. He doubted anyone would make any guesses about the two of them having a connection beyond battlefield opponents, but Claude still didn't want to run the risk if he could at all avoid it. From what I've heard, he's vying with the others for the throne. That kind of motive makes people dangerous. We'd best stay on our toes, Holst explained. Claude knew he wouldn't be able to correct Holst without making himself look suspicious, so he remained silent even though Holst's assumptions were beyond outdated. In truth, the only other prince of Almira was Khalid, someone who had vanished years prior when Claude surfaced in Leicester. There was no one for Shahid to compete with, not anymore, but his pride always pushed him to continue acting against his best interests. Shahid was not the sort to be dissuaded from any task he put his mind to, and unfortunately, that often went against what others would have preferred him to do. Claude couldn't say any of that though, so he instead opted for a less direct approach to telling Holst they would likely be fine, at least for the near future. You think? I felt like we did a pretty good job of slamming the door in his face just now. If it's a throne he's after, we just kicked him a little further away from it. An embarrassing loss like this ought to deter any other siblings from trying the same stunt. Maybe Claude's tongue was getting the better of him given his exhausted and weary state, but he couldn't bring himself to mind. If it would keep Holst or anyone else from asking questions about just what was going on within Almira's royal line, Claude was willing to take it. None of them knew the truth about what was going on there, and he was happy to kick them a little bit farther away from it. Oh, the irony of it all. I just hope they don't try anything like that again anytime soon, Hilda groaned as she continued to pick a few stray rocks out of her hair. That was exhausting, and I don't think I have it in me to do something like that again. I need a break and a long nap before I even think of picking up a weapon again. Just to accentuate her irritation, she flicked a rock away with her fingers, sending it bouncing a few times against the ground nearby. Your house does a lot of heavy lifting, and that isn't fair, Claude remarked with a shake of his head. He didn't like how often the soldiers of House Goneril had to fight against the attackers from Almira, and he disliked how easily Shahid's pride could get the better of him all the same. Claude wished there wasn't a conflict between his two nations at all, but as long as there was, he wished he could deal with it in a better way than just dumping the hard work onto Holst and his forces. He doubted Shahid would be willing to listen to reason, at least not yet, but he could still hope for the better. You came through with speedy reinforcements, and for that, I'm grateful, Holst started with a reassuring smile. Also, I heard from Margrave Edmund that you were planning on restoring the locket after this fight. You even personally intervened to make sure the funds were secured. There was something Claude had almost forgotten about. That was how he knew he needed to take a break from fighting and thinking about his brother. Too many things were slipping his mind. He normally wasn't like this, and he was going to do his best to rectify it when he got the chance. I did, Claude said instead of admitting just how much had gotten away from him while he was focused on the battle. Being honest about it would probably only make him look worse, and that wasn't something he was in the mood to deal with when Shahid was still weighing so heavily on his mind. You're very thorough. And very helpful. Between that and your impressive tact on the battlefield, the Alliance will be in good hands once you take the reins, Holst smiled. He held out one hand for Claude to shake it, and for a long moment, all Claude could do was stare. In truth though, this eternity was only so long in his head, and Claude hesitated for just a second in reality before he gladly took Holst's hand to shake it. That was not how he expected the day to end, but he wasn't going to complain about it at all either. Given just how much of a fit Count Gloucester had thrown over Claude taking over the Alliance in the past, this was certainly a welcome change. Who was Claude to complain? Hey, it's an honor to be accepted by a man as valiant as you. I think we'll get along just fine, Claude smiled. He pulled his hand away and let it rest easily at his side, though he felt the lingering traces of contact long after the fact. That we will, Holst returned with a grin of his own. Glad to hear it. So now that the battle's over, I want to feast until I burst. Come on, let's all go toast to Leicester's bright future. Claude declared, the mischievous gleam in his eye returning in full force. He still didn't feel entirely up to his regular energy levels, but it was at least a step in the right direction. After I take a bath and a nap, Hilda corrected. She pulled another rock out of her hair for emphasis. I think everyone else would agree. She tilted her head over in the direction of the rest of the golden deer, and when Claude glanced over to them, he saw that they were all looking just as haggard as Hilda. Even Shamir, who had been quiet up to that point, was starting to show her signs of exhaustion as she rubbed at her eyes with one hand. "It's a deal," Claude nodded. "Bath, nap, feast. Now that's an evening I can get behind." Maybe all of that would finally be enough to get Shahid off his mind. Claude could only hope so. He somehow knew already it wasn't going to be that easy though. Sure enough, it was not that easy. Claude spent much of the rest of the night feeling the constant buzz of anxiety grating against the back of his mind. He wanted to just forget everything going on with his brother, but that quickly established itself as unlikely at best or downright impossible at worst. At the very least, Claude felt better after taking a nap just as Hilda had suggested. The feast that followed was grand and much appreciated as well, and by the time Claude got back to the room he had been offered in the Goneril manse for the night, he was ready to fall asleep all over again thanks to just how much he had eaten. Claude practically collapsed against his bed, another sigh pushing its way free of his lips along the way. Now that he was on his own, he was free to let his walls down, though he couldn't say he felt entirely secure doing so just yet. Something about all of this still nagged at him as feeling wrong, but he couldn't quite put a finger on what it was. Part of Claude assumed it had to be about Shahid given just how his brother had behaved in the past, but he couldn't drag the truth into the light no matter how hard he tried. All he could do was sit there with his own helplessness and confusion. Before Claude could figure out what was going on though, a knock came at his door. He jerked into a seated position at that, putting on his regular mask without missing a beat. "Come in," Claude called out. Normally, he would have at least had the decency to greet his guest at the door, but his legs were still burning from the battle at the locket. Claude wasn't meant for long-term running like that, and he could feel it all throughout the lower half of his body. Luckily, the person who appeared in the entryway of the room didn't seem to mind. Claude blinked a few times as Lysathea made herself known, though she seemed offbeat somehow. Normally, Lysathea was composed at all times, never giving anyone the chance to see her when she was feeling less than perfect. Right now though, she was worried about something, and it was written all over her face. She had a slip of paper pressed in one hand, and her fingers were threatening to tear it to shreds from the intensity in her gaze. Claude watched her for a few seconds before he tilted his head to the side in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked. Part of him wondered if perhaps Shahid had somehow already recovered and decided to launch an attack in the evening when there would be fewer people around to defend the locket, but Claude quickly realized that wasn't the case. Shahid couldn't have healed his wounds and come back that quickly. Something else must have been going on, but Claude couldn't figure out what it was for the life of him. "We received a message from Lady Rhea," Lysathea replied. She walked over to Claude and handed him the slip of paper, and upon closer examination, he realized it was a page that had been folded in thirds. In other words, it had previously been stuffed into an envelope, but it had been removed after arriving in Goneril territory. The paper was elaborate and expensive too, even more proof that this missive was in fact from the Church of Syros. Somehow, the thought of receiving a message from Rhea of all people had Claude even more nervous than he would have been if he had learned Shahid was up to something nasty again. He accepted the note from Lysathea gladly, doing his best to hide just how strangely anxious he was about whatever could have been written there for him to see. He unfolded the page and read the message from Rhea, and when he did, his jaw dropped. Lysathea watched him carefully, clearly trying to see how he was going to respond. Claude just looked up at her with a slightly anxious smile before he let out a small but firm, "Oh." The last few days had been absolutely exhausting. About a week and a half had passed since Shay and the rest of the Black Eagles arrived in Inver, and Shay wasn't doing any better now than she had been when she first got there. In fact, she would argue that she was feeling worse. There was a constant underlying sense of anxiety that bubbled beneath the surface of everything she did. She was surrounded by nobles and other high-ranking authority figures, and that had never been Shay's area of expertise. She usually let whoever her current commander was take care of the diplomatic part of taking up mercenary work. She was no good at it, and she knew it. She was there to swing her sword around and stop the enemy forces, and now that Arundel and Ludwig were out of the picture, there wasn't much left for Shay to do. In her unending boredom, Shay had learned quite a bit about the machinations of the other nations of Fodlan for whatever that was worse. She had listened from afar to everything going on in Faergus and Leicester. The Grand Duke of the kingdom had been executed for his crimes, and Leicester had been attacked by invading forces from Almira. To put it simply, Shay hadn't been expecting any of that, though in hindsight, it made a lot of sense. Of course the other countries were facing hardships at the same time as Adrestia. It couldn't possibly be simple enough for only one country to struggle at any given moment. Of course not. Shay had no idea how she was supposed to feel about it all. She wondered what had prompted all of this in the first place, but the answer was quite clearly out of her reach. She couldn't do much of anything to solve the issues in the other countries, and she couldn't cure her own boredom either. A few times over the course of the last week, Arvel had proposed that they put their free time to good use by using it to track down the Ashen demon. Each time, Shay wound up being just barely too busy to be able to spare the chance. Of course. She felt like she didn't belong with the nobles of Adrestia, and she couldn't do anything to calm her love of combat either. She just felt constantly restless, and she had no idea what to do about it. Shay found herself spending a lot of time up on the balcony outside her room, letting her hands dangle off the edge of the boundary as she looked out over the world below. She knew she should have been glad to have a break from fighting, but instead, all she could think about was just how little she felt she belonged. It was nice to be able to spend time with the Black Eagles, and they were all more than happy to be around her when she needed the company, but Shay still wished she had something more to do with her time that wouldn't leave her feeling so worked up all the time. Besides, she couldn't spend much time with Edelgard, Hubert, or Monica as they turned their attention to the path ahead and the changing hands of the Empire's crown. It was unfortunate, but Shay knew it was something that needed to happen. That did nothing to help with her boredom though. Just standing here isn't going to help you at all, Arvel pointed out for at least the 12th time in the last 3 days. If you want to do something else with your time, you should say so. I bet somebody would be happy to give you something else to do. I know that, Shay sighed. But I don't know what I would even do. Everybody around here is a noble, and half of them are getting ready for what to do now that Edelgard is on the throne. There's not much fighting to be done, and that's all I really feel like doing right now. There has to be something out there for you to do, Arvel countered. Lord Arundel is still at large, and if you want to find him, I bet there would be room for you to try and track him down. He's the only person who can tell us the truth about where we come from, so we should at least try. And there was the other thing that had been constantly on Shay's mind lately. She wanted to know just where her strange abilities came from, but she could never quite figure it out. Arundel had been missing ever since the battle, and even though Shay had been trying to snoop around where she could, she never quite got far. How was she supposed to ask people where she came from when it seemed like it had so much to do with people everybody else had every reason to hate? She would just end up making herself look more suspicious, and that was the last thing she wanted. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Shay let out a shocked yelp at the sound of a voice behind her. She whirled around on instinct to see none other than Edelgard waiting for her in the entryway of her room. My apologies. You left your door open, and I wanted to talk to you, Edelgard explained. Shay pressed her hand against her chest and forced herself to breathe again, sighing once she regained a grip on herself. It's fine. I just got a bit too lost in my own head, she remarked. She was probably going to have to use that excuse many times from here on out. She tended to talk to Arvel when she was bored, and given her circumstances, that happened a lot more than it should have. I understand, Edelgard nodded. She walked a bit closer to Shay, taking up a position next to the mercenary near the balcony railing. Are you enjoying your stay at the palace? Shay hesitated for a long moment, trying to figure out if she should go with the honest answer or the response that would be more socially acceptable. She remembered halfway through that she was talking to Edelgard and therefore had no reason to hide, so she let out a sigh. I don't really feel like I fit in, Shay admitted. I'm doing my best to help out where I can, but it's hard when I'm not used to this life. It feels like I don't have anything to offer. Understandable. Everyone here is a noble themselves or serves one, Edelgard said, though her expression changed to shining determination a moment later. However, that will change. As Emperor, I plan to end discrimination based on social status. Everyone will have a chance to rise to the top, whether they are born into the aristocracy or not. Shay had no idea what she had been expecting to hear, but it certainly wasn't that. For a long moment, All she could do was stare at Edelgard, shocked at that but not at all upset by it. No more nobles or commoners, huh? That does sound pretty great. I'll be impressed if you can actually pull it off. Shay realized a bit too late that her words probably sounded a bit insulting. Edelgard wouldn't have been talking about it in the first place if she wasn't confident in herself. Sure enough, when Edelgard replied, her eyes gleamed with determination. "Oh, I will," she assured Shay. "But at the moment, I have a proposition for you." That was why Edelgard had wanted to speak with her. Shay didn't know what the proposal could have meant though, so she raised a curious eyebrow in Edelgard's direction. "Go on." "We've successfully expunged the Prime Minister and the rest of that puppet government," Edelgard started. "But a certain amount of unrest is unavoidable, which means I must remain here at the capital. In other words, I can't go back to Gareg Mach and continue my studies." Shay winced at the thought. She had thought about that many times over the course of the last week, but she had never been able to figure out what it would mean for her future. She didn't know anything about the Officers' Academy or how it functioned, and she especially didn't know what to do in the case of an entire class being forced to drop out because of a nationwide conflict. "I've been worried about that," Shay confessed. "What are we all supposed to do? Our noble families will be in disarray as we transition to my system and new heads of household take power," Edelgard explained. "Of course, some like Dorothea are not as affected as the other students. But I have spoken with each of them, and they all have offered to stay and help rather than return to the monastery without us. If you'd be willing to do the same, I'd like to offer you a top post in my new military." Shay couldn't help the way her jaw dropped at that. If Edelgard's plan was to go forward, then Shay wouldn't have gone back to the Officers' Academy at all. She would finally have the position in the military she had been craving so desperately, and more importantly, she would finally be free of her boredom. Beyond that, she would have the perfect path for her life ahead, at least hypothetically. Arvel was practically clamoring with excitement at the proposal, an impressed smile shining through in their voice. "Now there's a tantalizing offer. It's not like you have any real obligation to the church, so what's the harm? Plus, it sounds like quite the thrill." Shay was admittedly far less certain though, and she resisted the urge to wince. "I'm more of a hired sword than an officer. I can't say for certain I'd know what to do if I was given this position." "You being a mercenary is precisely why you're perfect for this position," Edelgard smiled, clearly having expected this protest from the outset. "Hubert wants to recruit mercenaries and other commoners such as yourself to form a new unit. Consider it one of our first steps to ensuring equality for all people regardless of class. I can't put some noble in command of them, that would be ill-advised. But they would listen to a capable fighter such as you. You're our first and only choice." Arvel let out an impressed whistle in the back of Shay's mind at that. "How can you refuse an offer like that?" they asked, practically daring Shay to say something in protest. "This position is being made solely for you, and it's being handed to you on a silver platter. What else can you say to that?" Shay knew Arvel was right, and she took in a careful breath before smiling to Edelgard. Her heart was racing with anticipation, and she had no idea what the path ahead was going to hold, but she was willing to face it no matter what. "I don't know if I really have the experience for it. But if you have that much faith in me, I won't let you down." Edelgard smiled with a firm nod in response, but before she could consider her next set of words, a knock came at the door frame. Shay and Edelgard both turned to see Monica peeking her head in between Shay's door and the wall. "Did she say yes?" Monica questioned. Edelgard nodded. "She did," Edelgard confirmed. "Do you need something, Monica? I would have thought you would be busy getting ready for Ferdinand to take over his father's duties." "I was," Monica replied carefully as she stepped into the room in full. Shay and Edelgard both walked in from the balcony, and the three girls met one another halfway. Monica had a simple envelope in hand, though the seal had already been broken. Upon closer examination, Shay realized the wax bore the symbol of the crest of Ceros, and for the third time in as many minutes, her jaw dropped from surprise. "A missive from Lady Rhea?" Edelgard asked, her eyes going wide as she accepted the envelope from Monica. "Yes. Hubert and I already read it, but we thought you should be the next person to read it," Monica said. We passed along the message that none of the Black Eagles could come back to finish out the year, and this was what we got in response. Edelgard carefully pulled the piece of paper out of the envelope and unfolded it. Shay was halfway tempted to read over her shoulder, but she forced herself to stay back, instead just anxiously tapping her foot against the floor of her room. After a few moments, Edelgard allowed herself to smile. She folded the page once again and slid it back into the envelope. "It seems Lady Rhea understands our circumstances perfectly," Edelgard said simply. "What did it say?" Shay questioned eagerly. "The Officers' Academy will be closing for the remainder of the year effective immediately," Edelgard explained as she passed the envelope back to Monica. "We don't need to worry about going back because the Blue Lions won't be able to return either. As such, the Golden Deer have been released from their classes as well, and the Officers' Academy will remain closed until a new class for each nation can be put together." Shay gaped at that for a long moment before she let out a small awkward huff of air. "What do you know?" she muttered. "That's certainly one way of solving that problem. And it's the preferable one," Edelgard finished for her before turning to face Shay in full. "We have all the time in the world to do as we so please. First and foremost, I want to do what I can to change Adrestia for the better. Are you with me?" Edelgard extended her hand to Shay, and the mercenary watched it for a long moment before a smile broke out on her face. Her answer was obvious, and she didn't need to think about it at all. She took Edelgard's hand in her own and gave it a fond and confident squeeze. Always. Chapter 27, As Days Go By. People of Fodlan. The Empire will stand by no longer. Shay ran freely through the training grounds of the Imperial Army's main camp, a sword grasped in both hands. Her hair billowed in the wind behind her as she sprinted full force toward one of the soldiers waiting for her at the other side of the training ground. Supposedly, these were among the best soldiers in the Empire, the perfect people to join Edelgard's cause. Shay was more than happy to put them to the test. After all, Edelgard had told her before that trusting stuffy nobles to know much of anything about combat was a poor idea, and Shay was more than happy to agree with her. Together, we rise against a that has become steeped in deception and corruption. Shay kicked herself off the ground and slashed both of her blades downward, cleaving a path forward effortlessly. The soldier before her threw up his lance to try and keep her advance at bay, but that could only do so much. Soon afterward, he had been forced to stumble backward, and Shay handily claimed the advantage in their sparring match. Nearby, other soldiers from the same battalion as Shay's foe winced at the sight, fully aware of just how intense she could be when she truly put her skills to the test. The Church has used their doctrine to deny you power and reshape Fodlan as they see fit. The soldier was quick to back down when he realized there was no chance of success for him as it was, so before Shay could follow up with another attack, he dropped his lance and held it up in surrender. Nearby, all of the other fighters watching the training match began to clap fearfully, afraid of what might happen if they didn't show Shay the proper respect for her skills. It was all a bit too steeped in interpersonal politics for Shay's taste, but she let out a small laugh regardless, effortlessly switching off her combat persona in favor of the mask of the personable commander she had become as of late. They thrust upon you the illusion of nobility in order to oppress who they choose, and they helped create the kingdom and alliance as a pretext for war. Our nations have been divided under the power of their greed, weakening us with their favoritism so that we cannot stand against them. 2 years had passed since the closure of the Officers' Academy, and in that time, Shay's life had changed in more ways than she could count. First and foremost, she looked different from her days at the monastery, having traded out her oppressive black uniform for the gray and crimson clothes she had come to love so much as a mercenary. Her hair had grown out slightly, always finding a way to counter the breeze. Her muscles had toned themselves along the way as well, and Shay could say with certainty that she had never been prouder of herself. Finally, they teased you with the promise of salvation from pain they themselves inflicted, and did so in the name of their own profit. Well, I say no more. Shay had changed in far deeper ways than just her appearance though. In the 2 years since the Officers' Academy closed, Shay had been promoted to a commander of the Imperial Army just as Edelgard had promised. Since then, Shay had been tasked with training the new recruits in a way that could get everyone on equal footing. She had turned out to be a fine teacher, far better than she expected. Even if many of her charges feared her raw skill and power, Shay was able to get them to loosen up enough to fix their issues of confidence. Just like that, the Imperial Army was well on its way to massive improvements, and Shay couldn't have been prouder. The Empire has severed herself from their hypocrisy by restoring the Southern Church and nurturing her people's well-being. And today, we purge the world of their evil forever. We will retake from the Central Church and stamp out any nobles who abet its depravity. As it turned out, Edelgard had been preparing for something big. She was gearing up for war against the Church, permanently severing the ties between Adrestia and Gareg Mach in one fell swoop. Her announcement speech had been made a few days ago, and Shay couldn't escape it even now. She thought about Edelgard's words practically every waking second, impressed and anxious in equal measure, not that she would ever admit the latter part out loud. After all, Shay needed to be a paragon of confidence if those following her were to feel they could win this battle too. She couldn't get too caught up in her own faltering thoughts as long as so much was waiting for her in the next few weeks. By my title as Emperor Edelgard von Hresvelg of Adrestia, I hereby declare war against the false Church of Ceros. Shay turned back to face the rest of the soldiers gathered before her, unable to pull her smile away from her features all the while. Even if they were still newer recruits, she could tell they had potential, and she was more than happy to push them until they were able to shine. She wouldn't be too intense so as to not scare them away, but she knew what they needed, and she was more than happy to provide it. What kind of teacher would she be if she failed at the first true obstacle of training her students? The war against the Church of Ceros was set to begin in full in a few days. Edelgard had made her declaration as an offer for Rhea to back down, but the Archbishop had not followed up on it. Shay could only assume that meant Rhea was quietly preparing her weapons and her forces for a battle with Gareg Mach as the stage. It didn't matter much to her what Rhea chose to do with all of this. Shay knew where her loyalties rested, and that wasn't going to change just because Rhea got particularly upset with her about it. Shay had heard the truth of why Edelgard was doing this as soon as the Emperor felt comfortable sharing it with the rest of the Black Eagles, or as they were now known, the Black Eagles Strike Force, the heart of the Imperial Army. Edelgard believed the system of crests and nobility was overrun with corruption, and Shay couldn't help but agree, especially given what had spurred them into action so many years ago in the first place. If the nobility of Fodlan was corrupt, then they wouldn't be pushed back into line with a polite request to play nice. If this was what Edelgard thought was for the best, then Shay trusted her. She was there to act as a blade of the Imperial Army, and she wouldn't even think of disappointing those who had taken a chance on her. She had come a long way, and she was proud of where she stood now. This was where she was meant to be, and she wouldn't let herself forget it. Shay opened her mouth to say something to the group of recruits standing before her, but she stopped just before she allowed herself to speak the words. On the other side of the training grounds, she could see Dorothea, Bernadetta, and Petra walking back toward the central part of the camp. Shay already knew exactly where they were going, and she winced. She had lost track of time without realizing it, and while that wasn't shocking at all for her, she still wished she had been at least a bit more conscious of all this. "We'll continue our lesson later," Shay declared to the recruits gathered around her. "For now, I have a meeting to attend to. Grab your training weapons and try to spar with one another. Take note of your mistakes so you can correct them later. I'll be back to help you through that later this afternoon." The soldiers were happy to listen to Shay's instruction, and the mercenary let out a small sigh with a light smile on her face. She couldn't say she had ever expected herself to end up as a commander in an army, but she was beyond happy with how it had turned out. This was where she was meant to be whether she realized it at the time or not. Coming to join the Black Eagles had been the best decision she ever made for herself. Edelgard hadn't been kidding when she said she had an amazing offer to make to Shay 2 years ago, and Shay couldn't imagine her life without taking her up on it. Dorothea, Bernadetta, and Petra had all stopped walking at the edge of the training yard when they realized Shay was trying to catch up with them, and they all watched their mercenary friend with small but fond smiles. "Hey, you three," Shay greeted as she slid to a stop beside them. She tucked her blades into their sheaths where they rested at her waist before placing her hands on her hips. "It's been a while since I've seen all of you in the same place." The Black Eagles had been, by definition, very heavily involved with the declaration of war since they had vowed to fight at Edelgard's side. Dorothea had taken more to humanitarian work with those who were already struggling since everyone knew the war was going to hit the poorest people of Adrestia the hardest. Bernadetta offered her services every once in a while, but for the most part, she kept to herself, though she had come out of her shell considerably since her father had been given his promotion. Last but not least, Petra had been sent back to Brigid for a short while to foster peace there, and she had only returned within the last few weeks as the war marched closer to its beginning. I suppose it has been a while, Dorothea agreed with a smile, her green eyes glowing all the while. Still, I don't think we would have been able to stay away from one another forever. After all, this is what we've been working for over these last few years. I still don't think I'm ready, Bernadetta confessed. But I guess I'm never really going to be. I'll just have to figure it out. She offered a shaky smile to Shay, something she had clearly been practicing but couldn't quite commit to in full. You'll be fine, Bernadetta, Shay assured her, wrapping an arm around the purple-haired girl with a grin. Bernadetta was usually fairly picky with who she allowed to touch her, but Shay had always been one of the few able to worm her way past Bernadetta's defenses, and Shay was glad to have been granted that honor. You've come a long way, and I know we can count on you when we need you most. It is nice to be back here, Petra beamed. Much has changed since I was last in Fodlan. But I am glad to see everyone is still doing well. Shay couldn't help the way her eyes went wide at the way in which Petra was speaking. When she had last spoken to Petra, the Princess of Brigid had been tripping over her words and unable to truly come to grips with speaking the language of Fodlan. All of that seemed to have melted away now, and while Petra was still no doubt better in her mother tongue, she had come a long way even so. Shay's surprise must have been written all over her face, and Petra laughed at the sight. I have been practicing my speaking over the last few years. I still have a long way to go, but I am making fine progress, she explained to Shay. Much has changed since we were last able to speak with one another. You can say that again, Shay nodded. But I'm glad to have all the Black Eagles back in one place. As much as I love everyone else, it's just not same when we're split up. I've missed having everyone together. That makes it sound like we've been the only ones too busy to come by and visit you, Dorothea pointed out. Was Lynn really around you that much? Her tone had shifted toward the teasing, and Shay resisted the urge to laugh. He wasn't there because he wanted to be, Bernadetta replied. Casper dragged him all around the camp when he could though. He never seemed to like it all that much, but he didn't complain as much as he could have. Take that however you want to. What Bernadetta said, Shay told Dorothea with a shrug. I've gotten used to mostly seeing the guys, Monica and Edelgard around here. It's nice to be able to break through that pattern now though. We're all going to be together again after all this time. I wish it was for the sake of better circumstances, Petra confessed. I am glad to be back here, but I worry for the war to come. I understand that Edelgard has her goals under control, but it's still worrying, Bernadetta agreed with a nod. I never thought things would change so fast here in the Empire, but I guess that's what I get for letting myself get too comfortable. You can say that again, Shay nodded. Saying the Empire had changed quickly and drastically was a massive understatement in her opinion. The Southern Church had been reconstructed after all these years, and that had been the start of a long ripple effect that completely changed Adrestia to the point of it almost being unrecognizable. New people had taken control of different aspects of public life, and new services had been put into effect to help those at the bottom of society's current social hierarchy. It was impressive just how quickly everything had changed. Shay was happy to see it as long as it was helping people, though she was going to need some time to truly grapple with everything she had witnessed. We can speak with Edelgard and the others about everything that has happened, Petra pointed out. If we continue to talk here, then we are going to be late to our meeting. I doubt Monica would be happy with us if we took too long. Shay winced at that, having completely forgotten the reason she was forced to leave her training session so early. You're right. I'd rather not deal with her wrath today, she murmured. In truth, Monica's rage was far less intense than Shay made it sound, but to put it simply, Monica could be intense when things didn't go exactly as she had planned. This would only stress her out more, and that was the last thing Shay wanted. Then let's get going, Dorothea declared. With that, she started off toward the central tent of the camp, and the other three followed after her. Shay unhooked her arm from around Bernadetta's shoulders, instead resting her hands easily on the hilts of her blades. She had no reason to think she would need to pull them out at a moment's notice, but Shay still liked the feeling of safety and familiarity that came with having her swords present. Her old life had melted away considerably since she had first gone to the officers' academy, and while Shay had gotten used to change long ago, she liked to hold to a few pieces of the past whenever she could, regardless of how infrequently that was. Along the way to the meeting, Shay couldn't help but think of just how much had changed in the Empire. She had come a long way since being given her military position, but she was far from the only one who had undergone significant evolution. The Empire as a whole had been pulled farther and farther away from the Church of Ceros with time, a direct consequence of Edelgard's efforts to change the nation under her rule. The government had been reformed in many major ways over the last 2 years, and corrupt nobles had been ousted from their positions all over the country. Shay didn't understand the finer details of it, but she knew all too well just how far the Empire's military had come over the last few years, and she was proud to have been a key player in that specific shift for the better. Beyond that, the religion of the Empire had changed significantly, and while Shay had never been particularly mindful of the Church's teachings, even she knew just how taboo it was that the Southern Church had returned to power. It had been stripped of its strength within the Empire because of its past disobedience against the Archbishop, but Edelgard had given the Southern branch its power once again. The bishop was hated all across the continent for various reasons though, and the Central Church had targeted him for assassination countless times. Whenever the subject came up though, Hubert just laughed to himself and claimed it was nothing for Shay to worry about. She knew better than to push him too far when he got caught up in his chuckles like that, so she was fine with abandoning the subject. Besides, Count Varley being busy most of the time made Bernadetta happier, so who was Shay to complain? That wasn't to say everything had been perfect over the last few years though. In fact, Shay found herself at a glaring loss for words and information regarding her past and future. She had spent an almost embarrassing amount of time trying to figure out where she came from and what her strange powers meant, but she was never able to find anything helpful. She had hoped that perhaps Lord Arundel, shifty as he was, would be able to offer her answers, but he had been missing for 2 entire years. There was no easy way for Shay to press him for information when he wasn't there in the first place, and she was well beyond irritated about it. But she chose to not think about him for the time being, knowing that it would just put her in a sour mood in a time when she should have been happy. At long last, she was meeting up with the rest of the Black Eagles in one location for the first time in ages, and that was something to celebrate. Sure, they were coming together as a way of preparing for war, but Shay was fine with that as long as she could keep her eyes turned to the future. They would be able to find a way through this together. If there was any group Shay knew she could count on, it was the rest of the Black Eagles. That wasn't to say she wasn't anxious about the war, of course. In fact, Shay was worried about what this would mean for her future. She had never imagined Fodlan would slip into another war in her lifetime, much less that she would be fighting on the side of the aggressor. Still, Edelgard had taught her a lot over the last few years, and Shay could say without a shadow of a doubt that the world needed to change. The system of crests and nobles was corrupt, and after being given multiple peeks into its innermost functions, Shay had come to understand that all too well. Edelgard believed the best way to bring peace for the future generations of Fodlan was through war, and Shay trusted her judgment above all else. If this was what Edelgard thought was best, then Shay had faith in her. Speaking of Edelgard, she stood easily in front of the table at the heart of the Kemp's strategy room, looking down at a map as she pressed her fingers against the wood below. Beside her, Hubert examined the page as well. Ferdinand was clearly doing his best to imitate Hubert's cool confidence for the sake of blocking out Monica's pacing as her heels clicked against the floor below. She always got agitated when people showed up late to meetings, especially those she was involved with planning. Shay had gotten used to it long ago, though she knew Ferdinand had never done quite as well with Monica's nerves when they got the better of her. "Sorry we're late," Shay greeted, though she took slight relief in the fact that she was far from the only one to be late. In fact, there were others even beyond her quartet that had fallen behind schedule. Caspar and Linhard were nowhere to be found, and if Shay had to guess, she would have assumed that was because of Linhard getting caught up in either a nap or his research to the point of forgetting their pending meeting entirely. From there, Caspar would have to drag him out of his bed or his desk chair to bring him to meet with the others. That was the way it always worked, and Shay had gotten used to it ages ago. Sure enough, Dorothea tapped on Shay's shoulder to tell her to step aside. Right on cue, Casper came barreling through the door, dragging Linhard along all the while. The irritated look on his face and the yawn on his lips told Shay that Linhard had, in fact, been sleeping before all of this began, and he was not at all satisfied with Casper daring to pull him away from his sheets and comforter. Still, Linhard said nothing, knowing that being snarky was bound to just earn him an extra bit of Monica's ire. Finally, Monica sighed as she turned to face Edelgard. Now that everyone is here, we can begin our final strategy meeting. Edelgard nodded with a smile. She had come to look much tenser over the course of the last few years, but she still did her best to grin whenever she could, though it seemed to be for the sake of those around her more than anything else, taking a weight off her shoulders by convincing them not to worry. I am glad to see you were all able to make it, Edelgard started. She was far less bothered by half the group's tardiness than Monica, and her relaxed demeanor seemed to be enough to start thawing away at the iceberg of the redhead's stress. We were happy to come, Dorothea nodded with a smile. Beside her, Bernadetta and Petra indulged in the same gesture. It's been a long time since all of us were here in the same place. We've been so busy over the last few years that it seems like we've barely had a moment to spend time as a class. I don't know if I would really call this spending time as a class, Linhard interjected as he brushed a few stray pieces of dirt off his outfit. We're preparing for a war, aren't we? I feel as if that crosses the line of student bonding into something else. Besides, the officers' academy closed years ago. What class is there even left at this point? We're still working together, aren't we? Shay smiled, not letting Linhard's dreary mood get in her way. We've got a long road ahead of ourselves, but we're going to face it with everything we have. That starts with the first step of the plan. We begin our march on Gareg Mach tomorrow, Edelgard declared. I offered the church officials found within a chance to surrender, but they have refused to answer my call. I believe that tells us everything we need to know about their current thoughts regarding the war, and we should proceed as planned. It'll be strange to go back to Gareg Mach under circumstances like this, Casper confessed with a frown. I didn't imagine myself ever returning to the monastery at all, much less that I would go there as part of, well, an army. Such is what is required for our path into the future, Hubert hummed. Will you stand loyal to the path we have carved out for ourselves? Of course I will, Casper told him, exasperated and insulted at the mere implication that he would back down in the face of the current conflict. It's just a bit odd for me to think about. Stop messing with him, Hubert, Monica sighed with a roll of her eyes, taking any and every chance she had to make a jab at Hubert. No matter how many times Edelgard told the two of them to try and play nice, it always ended with some snarky comment or another in the other's direction. We have more important things to focus on right now. Edelgard, as per usual, was the one to get the group back on task again. We will be able to storm through the monastery with relative ease as far as I can tell, she began. The Knights of Syros have been struggling to maintain any sense of unity ever since the massive split-up 2 years ago. Sending such large factions to different countries caused deep issues within the Church's command, and I doubt they will be able to fend off our assault once we start to charge after them. So we can take advantage of the fact that they've been struggling to knock them out, Shay smiled with a nod. That's something I'm happy to do. It's going to be a hard fight, but I'm looking forward to it. It's been a while since I've seen anything too challenging these last few years. That's something I can get behind too, Casper grinned. I've been trying to hone my skills as much as possible, but it's hard to feel like you're making any progress when there's not really a place for you to show off everything you've learned. You can satisfy your love of violence when we arrive at the monastery then, Linhard sighed, not at all surprised by Casper's dark enthusiasm but not entirely satisfied with it either. We should have 2 days left of marching before we arrive there. You make it sound so simple, Bernadetta muttered. I know we've been planning this for a long time, but I still don't like the idea of us attacking the church. I don't know what they have planning there, and I'm worried about what they're going to end up being capable of when we start to attack them. This is the only way for the world as we know it to make meaningful change in the right direction, Edelgard declared. If we want the world to get better, then we need to be willing to fight for it, and that begins with us charging Gareg Mach to dethrone Rhea from power. As long as she stands at the center of the monastery, we won't stand a chance of succeeding. What about the other countries? Petra questioned. I am afraid I have not yet been caught up on their responses to all of this. The kingdom refused us, not that I'm surprised by that at all, Hubert told her. They find it to be completely absurd to think they would work with a nation that wants to destroy the church. Given how many of the nobles there are obsessed with upholding the status quo to a beyond feverish degree, I cannot say that I am shocked. None of us should be. The alliance has done its best to remain neutral in the face of this, though I suspect that more has to do with the fact that they couldn't come to an agreement at the round table, Monica said. It seems like none of the nobles in Leicester can agree on anything when it counts, though that certainly plays to our favor. It makes our lives much easier if we know they won't be providing reinforcements to Garreg Mach. As it stands, not even the kingdom can offer aid for the church, Ferdinand chimed in. They are still struggling from the aftermath of the Grand Duke's attempted coup from 2 years ago, and they have no spare soldiers to provide to Garreg Mach. Then this will be nice, clean, and easy, Shay grinned. All that's left is for us to carry out the job. I'm counting on all of you to do your best in preparation for the battles to come, Edelgard nodded firmly. This is where the battle truly begins, and we must be ready. I've never been more prepared for anything in my life, Shay beamed. You can count on us. I promise. I would never dare to believe I couldn't, Edelgard assured her. A light smile played at her lips, and even though they were preparing themselves for war, Shay felt at peace. No matter what, they would find a way to be all right. She could just feel it. It was strange just how quickly everything could change, but Shay was fine with it. This was where she was meant to be, and she couldn't have asked for anything better. The Black Eagles were her family, and no matter what, they would be there for one another. At the moment, that meant preparing for a war against the church, but Shay was fine with that. She was ready for this, and nothing in the world could have torn her down now. All that was left was to execute the plan, and Shay knew they would be all right. If Edelgard, Hubert, Monica, and Ferdinand were confident this would work, then so was Shay. They had been working toward this for years, and their efforts wouldn't be in vain. No matter what, they would succeed, and the Church of Ceros would be brought to its knees. This may not have been the path Shay expected, but it was the path she was happiest to follow, and she would show it when the battle arrived. She was ready, and she always would be. She just hoped the Church of Ceros was ready for her too, even if it wouldn't save them now. Chapter 28, Drums of War. The remainder of the preparations for the march on Garreg Mach took place over the course of the day, and Shay had her hands full and then some. She had to issue an apology to her trainees to say they would have to get back to their training again another time, but none of them pushed it too hard, all fully aware of just how much she had on her plate given her new promotion. Shay admittedly would have preferred to spend her time sparring and helping to prepare the newest generation of the Empire's soldiers, but she knew she didn't have much of a choice at this point. Her position as a commander required her to work on a lot of small things around the camp, and she wasn't going to neglect her duties for the sake of her entertainment. That was a bad idea in general, but if she did, she would never hear the end of it from him. This place always finds new ways to impress me. Arvel's voice rang in the back of Shay's mind as she walked through the field where the Black Eagles had set up their camp. There were many soldiers standing around the region, but more importantly, there were merchants of all kinds, and they were the ones who had managed to catch Arvel's attention. Shay couldn't help but snicker at that. You're an odd person to take an interest in merchants, Arvel, she pointed out. It's not like you can really buy much of anything from them. It comes with the territory of being a phantom in the back of my head. I can still help you to make your purchases, and this is where you can find the weapons that will make this war that much easier on you, Arvel pointed out, just as focused on what really mattered as always. Shay couldn't say she was surprised, but it earned a small laugh from her lips even so. It amazes me just how quickly you were able to rise through the ranks of the Adrestian army. Most people would have never been able to dream of something like this. Most people aren't working under someone like Edelgard, Shay countered. If she wants equality between all the soldiers, then she's going to find a way to accomplish it. That's the reason I'm here, right? I suppose so. Though there are many more advantages to this than just being a commander, Arvel told her. For one, this is how you can continue your quest to track down the Ashen demon. Shay stopped walking at that, resisting the urge to hiss. She had honestly forgotten about that. It sounded awful when she said it like that, but the fact of the matter was that she had been too busy over the last few years to really focus too much attention on tracking the Ashen demon. Shay was fine with that whether she wanted to admit it openly or not. She was happy here, and there wasn't much of a reason for her to fill her life with something that didn't contribute to that joy. I don't really know what to think of all that honestly, Shay confessed. I've been so busy here that I haven't really thought about finding her again all that much, and while I know I will one day. Well, this is where I am now. Edelgard has given me a great life here, and I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I'd like to think I'm not that selfish. I'm not trying to push you into something you're not interested in, Arvel said. That was what you wanted to do when we first met one another, and you're trying to show that you have an interest in what I do, Shay finished for them, and she felt Arvel nod from the back of her mind. I'm glad to have you in my life for things like this, Arvel. You've done a lot for me over the last 2 years, and I can't say it enough. I mean, you're part of the reason I was able to make it this far. What can I say? We work well as a team. What sort of partner in destiny would I be if I didn't offer you a bit of help from time to time? Arvel pointed out, and Shay laughed once again. If you don't want to find the Ashen demon anymore, then we don't have to focus on that. Besides, I imagine the war will keep us more than busy when it finally begins in full. We should be arriving at Gareg Mach in a few days, and when that time comes, we're going to have our hands very full, Shay agreed with a nod. And I'm sure I'm going to go after them again one day. I don't think I can just leave behind everything that happened when I was with my old company. They did a lot for me, and if I did nothing to honor their memories, I feel like I'd be a pretty crappy last survivor of our group, you know. It's something we can think about when we're not trying to march on the monastery. You know, when our days are filled with something other than thinking of how to not get burned alive by the Archbishop when she realizes we betrayed her after she gave us a place at the Officers' Academy in the first place, Arvel told her, and Shay once again winced. Arvel let out a loose scoff. Not looking forward to that, are you? I feel a bit bad about having to face her, Shay confessed. You're right when you say she was the one who gave us a chance here in the first place, and I don't think I'm going to like whatever she has to say to me. I mean, it'll probably be accurate, and she's well within her rights to say that given what we're about to do, but there's still time to back down from this if you'd prefer that, Arvel remarked. If you would rather stand with the people of the monastery, then you should be accepted with open arms. Nope, Shay cut in immediately. I've been here for the last 2 years, and I'm not going to just up and leave everyone after everything they did for me. Beyond that, I believe Edelgard when she talks about her vision of the future. It wouldn't be right of me to just stab her in the back after all of that, so I'm not going to. Sure, it'll get a lot of people to hate us, but that's just sort of what happens when you wage war. Edelgard has made up her mind about this, and I trust that she made the best decision for everyone. If this is what will help more people in the long run, then that's what we're doing. I'm glad to hear your resolve is just as firm as ever, Arvel nodded. This is going to sound awful, but I don't think I would have been able to stand it if we had sided with the church here. Something about the people there just makes me feel gross. Maybe it has something to do with my lack of memories. I have no clue. They just bother me for some reason. Shay hummed at that, not entirely certain as to how she was meant to respond. She couldn't say she remembered too much about how she had felt at the time when she first met Rhea, but she didn't think it mattered much anymore either. She was going to be attacking the people of the church before the week ended, so why would she bother with thinking back on the past? All that mattered now was the future, and there was a dark future on the horizon for the Church of Syros. Before Shay could come up with a meaningful reply to Arvel's comments though, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A quick pivot saw there were 2 people talking nearby, and Shay's jaw dropped at the sight of them. Hold on. Is that? Hanneman and Manuela were talking near one of the stalls in the main area of the camp, their discussion clearly rather animated. At the very least, they weren't arguing or otherwise trying to get at one another's throats, and that was definitely a good thing in Shay's opinion given just how prone to bickering they had both proven themselves to be back at the monastery. Shay approached them slowly, waving in an effort to catch their attention. "What are you two doing here?" Shay greeted, not wanting to interrupt their discussion but knowing she had little choice. As was to be expected, the two went silent immediately, and Manuela's face broke out in a wide smile. "Ah, Shay!" she exclaimed. "I didn't realize I could look forward to seeing you here. Though I suppose it makes sense. You were a member of the Black Eagles back in the day, weren't you?" "That I was," Shay confirmed with a nod. "Though I didn't think I would see you two here on our side of the war. I mean, we are kind of trying to take the monastery by force." Hanneman finished for her, and Shay nodded despite just how awful she knew it looked to agree with something like that. Still, if it was the truth, how could she really object to it? Hanneman nodded his understanding. "We joined Edelgard's side of this fight because we believe her vision for the future to be for the best. We think she has the best ideals in mind, and so, here we are." "But shouldn't you be back at the monastery?" Shay questioned. "After all, you both worked there before all of this, didn't you?" "We did, but that was before the officers' academy closed," Manuela sighed. "There hasn't been another class put together for us to teach, so all we can really do is stay here. Edelgard offered us a position in her army, and who were we to refuse an offer like that? She has the right of it, if you ask us, so why would we ever dream of standing against her?" "Oh, yeah," Shay realized. "I guess I forgot about the officers' academy closing all those years ago. But I'm glad to see you both here, if not a bit surprised. We both hail from the Empire, and we have experience with the system of life here," Hanneman explained. "Coming here felt natural for us, and so, here we are. Who are we to resist a life that would benefit us both in the short and long term? I'm glad to have you both on our side," Shay smiled. "We can use all the help we can get at this point. I know the entire kingdom is going to be there to reinforce the church when push comes to shove, and I don't know if the alliance is entirely keen on the idea of us starting this war. Any help is much appreciated." "Of course. You can always count on us," Manuela assured her. "What about you? What are you set to do here in the army?" "I'm a commander," Shay answered easily. Edelgard was hoping to establish a system of equality in the army, and that started with finding a suitable commander and leader for the commoners who live here in Adrestia. I wound up being assigned to that position, and I'm glad I was. I can already tell I'm going to have a great time here. I believe you'll do a fine job of it as well," Manuela smiled. "If you ever find yourself in need of patching up, you can come to find me. I'll be fighting in some of our later battles, but for this first one, Edelgard wants me and Hanneman to stay behind so we can set up the infirmary in full. We still have a few last-minute preparations to take care of, and that needs to be our first priority as long as we're going up against something as massive as the church." "Do be careful in the battle at the monastery," Hanneman told Shay. "You can't fight too risky if you want to keep your career in the army. We want you to come back in one piece. Ideally, you won't even need to come by the medical tent at all." "I'll be careful," Shay assured them. "Don't worry about me. I'll hold you to it," Manuela said with a wink. Shay started away at that, a smile on her face. There were two faces she hadn't expected to see there of all places, not that she was at all complaining. In fact, she was glad to be able to reunite with Hanneman and Manuela once more. She had never expected to run into them again after the officers' academy was closed down, not that she thought of it too much. Honestly, the only professor she had been expecting to see again was Juritsa, and Shay let out a loose yelp as she almost collided with him, and she staggered backward just to make sure she gave him the space he needed. Sorry about that," she stammered out. Shay liked to think she was above being afraid of people most of the time since, at the end of the day, every person she met was a human just like her. Still, Juritsa was the notable exception to that rule, not that Shay had ever admitted it out loud. He was simply unsettling with how quiet he was, and even though she knew he wasn't going to hurt her or anything similar, he was still quiet and odd enough to catch her off guard. On top of all that, Juritsa had something of a hobby of standing alone and not saying anything, too caught up in his own thoughts to do much to attract the attention of others. Case in point, he had been quiet and just isolated enough for Shay to not notice he was there until she almost collided with him in full. only barely managing to avoid slamming into his shoulder. His impressive height eclipsed Shay and then some, and she felt like she was left in his shadow when he turned to face her. Shay was ready to consider the conversation over so she could go back to making the rounds through camp, but Juritsa seemed to see something else in her expression. "You are shocked to see me here," he told her bluntly. It was a statement of fact rather than an inquiry. Shay thought about it for a moment, and she realized that, as a matter of fact, she was surprised to see him there. She had always gotten the impression Juritsa was involved with Edelgard more than the church, but Juritsa still hadn't been around much during the planning stages of the war over the last few years. That wasn't to say Shay knew what he had been up to since she was, expectedly, completely clueless. She hadn't thought much about what he could have been up to since she was so busy as of late, but seeing him there now, she had to wonder just what he had been up to over the last few years. Shay was quick to snap herself back together though when she realized that Juritsa expected a response instead of her just staring up at him like she had seen a ghost. He didn't care about her shock at all, instead just continuing to look down at her. Halfway through formulating a reply, Shay realized he had abandoned the use of the white mask he had been seen with throughout his time as a professor at the officers' academy. His face was entirely bare, though the skin beneath his eyes was dark and sunken in with an exhaustion Shay doubted she would ever fully understand. But she did understand one thing, and it was that Juritsa being there wasn't anywhere near as surprising as Hanuman or Manuela choosing to leave behind the church in favor of joining the rebellion. "I'm not that shocked," Shay eventually managed to push out. "You seemed really close with Edelgard even back at the monastery." Juritsa would have hummed like he was impressed if he was at all inclined to show emotion, but since he didn't care enough to bother, he instead just nodded. "I have a contract with the Emperor," he said in response. Shay was halfway expecting him to elaborate a bit more, but she remembered she was talking to Jurtiza of all people soon afterward. Of course he wasn't going to say anything else if he could at all get away with staying quiet. That was just the kind of person he was, and she had gotten used to it years ago. In fact, Shay could tell Juritsa wanted to be left alone again, so she nodded to herself. "Thanks for explaining that to me, Professor Juritsa," she told him. She didn't think she even needed to offer an excuse or a justification to leave, but her natural social instincts forced her to provide one, and so, she did. "I am no professor," Juritsa pointed out. "I never was, and I especially am not now." Shay was on the verge of asking what she should call him if his title was no longer applicable, something he was technically correct about, but Juritsa beat her to it. "Just my name is fine." "Good to know," Shay nodded. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind." Jurtiza said nothing else in response, not that Shay had been expecting him to continue talking. Instead, she just turned on her heel and walked away, letting out a small sigh along the way. She was going to have to keep one eye open for Juritsa from then on just to make sure she didn't end up running into him. Shay kicked herself internally for not noticing someone so massive was standing right in front of her until she had almost run straight into him, but given how quiet and still he always was, she could forgive herself for it to some degree. She did her best to shake the thought off for now, knowing there were other things she needed to focus on first and foremost. "It's nice to see at least he hasn't changed over the last 2 years, Arvel remarked offhandedly. "I can't say I expected it, but at least we're on equal footing with him now. That has to mean something." "I don't think he cares much for the ways in which modern society tells people to treat others below their social station," Shay pointed out. "I don't think he cares for much at all aside from fighting. I can relate to him in that way at least. Or, at the very least, you would if he didn't look at everyone with an apathetic glare that scares every other person in his life away," Arvel snorted, and Shay wanted to object to the harshness of their statement even though she knew she had no room to talk. Arvel had a bit of a point whether she wanted to admit it or not, she was afraid of him to some degree herself, after all. Shay distracted herself with looking around the rest of the camp, and she found a few other people she was only vaguely aware of scattered throughout the area. She had seen Ladislava meeting with Edelgard many times in the past, though Shay had never been there for their actual discussions since it felt like it was above her station. Ladislava being a woman of few words did little to help Shay feel any better about intruding since she knew she could talk a bit much for the tastes of those around her. Randolph and Flesh were considerably friendlier in Shay's opinion, but judging by the way the two of them were talking to one another, they were busy with other matters at the moment. Shay didn't want to interrupt or distract them from whatever they needed to work out for the moment. There are a lot more people here than I would have expected, Arvel confessed, quickly catching on to the change in subject. I would have anticipated Edelgard's reforms to be unpopular among most people, but I am pleasantly surprised to see I was wrong in that assumption. There are many people here who want to change their lots in life. I think the rebellion 2 years ago changed a lot for the war today, Shay told them. If we hadn't gotten rid of Lord Arundel and Duke Agir when we did, I bet a lot of people would still be under their thumbs, and we wouldn't have much of a way to march onward if they were pushing back against our efforts so firmly. Now that they're out of the picture though, Edelgard can introduce her reforms much more aggressively, and as people become aware of what she's trying to do, it all falls into place, Arvel finished, and Shay nodded her confirmation. As nice as it is to see the people of the Empire are agreeing with her, I know other people won't feel the same way. We have to march on the monastery for a reason. The church doesn't like what she's doing, and we have to fight through them if we want to reach our brighter future. Shay nodded with a sigh. So be it then. If this is the price of a better world of tomorrow, then it's something I'm willing to fight through. Even if that means making an enemy of the church. Good. I'm glad we agree, Arvel smirked. I would love to see the looks on their faces when they realize the position they're in now. Oh, what a joy that would be. Rhea had never been this angry before. News of Edelgard's declaration of war had come in a few weeks ago, and Rhea had spent the bulk of the days since preparing for the inevitable attack against Gareg Mach as led by the Emperor. She was doing her best to pull the pieces together in a way that would allow her to maintain control over the monastery, but she could see the cracks in her defenses. Rhea had allowed her guard to drop without even realizing it, and there was no way for her to make up for all she had lost. Edelgard had her at a disadvantage, and she despised it. Rhea's face had been set in a nearly constant glare over the last few weeks, and Seath and Flane had grown used to seeing her full of rage ever since. When the pair arrived in the cathedral to speak with Rhea about the next step of their plans, she was staring the statue of the goddess with all the intensity in the world, and she didn't turn to face them until Seath spoke. The Imperial army has invaded Burgundy and will reach Gareg Mach within the week. With no way to stop their advance, we must ready ourselves for a siege, Seath told her. It was hardly a surprise, but the statement made anger boil over in Rhea's stomach all over again. How are we to hold the monastery with such short-handed numbers? Flane asked softly. The church had been struggling a lot with maintaining its control across the continent thanks to the southern church rising up again. From there, the western church had been inspired to start yet another rebellion. There was no safety from the two groups actively vying for the attention of the church, and as a result, there was no security within the halls of Gareg Mach. They wouldn't be able to breathe easily until all of this ended, and all three of them knew it. It is possible the Empire orchestrated that entire incident to bleed off our strength. Look at how thoroughly information about it was buried, and how quickly the Empire invaded after declaring war. It all feels carefully calculated, Rhea murmured. She should have known this was inevitable when the Southern Church started to reconstruct itself. At first, she had thought it was an extension of the Empire thanking the Church for their help in fending off the rebellion that had racked in Bear 2 years prior. It was poorly executed, of course, given just how much Rhea frowned upon the Western Church and how little she liked the Southern Church given its history, but she had thought it was something. Then, in the blink of an eye, that ideal had slipped away quickly when the bishop spoke against Rhea and sowed discontent among the imperial populace, prompting them to seek the aid of the church within their own nation rather than the organization at Gareg Mach. In truth, the Southern Church had been a wedge between the Central Church and the Empire. The reasoning behind it was all clear as could be now, and Rhea hated Edelgard more than ever for it. I would not put it past them, Seath sighed, pinching at the bridge of his nose along the way. He was fighting off a headache for the 15th time in the last few weeks, and that was a generously low estimate. If they bring war to our doorstep, they will want us on the worst footing possible. If the tides turn against us, we may have to abandon Gareg Mach. Never, Flane cut in immediately. She had been doing her best to keep spirits high ever since the declaration of war, but that was much easier said than done. She could still offer some degree of enthusiasm though, and that started with vowing to hold the monastery as a strategic position. Edelgard is already using the Southern Church to erode our legitimacy, and now she has the gall to try and remove us by force. There can be no mercy for tyrants. So help me, I would to put her entire army to the sword myself, Rhea muttered. She couldn't believe the audacity of the Emperor. Rhea had welcomed her into the officers' academy years ago, and the instant she was given the chance, Edelgard still plunged a dagger in her back. Now, Rhea was going to have her revenge. She refused to make this easy for the invaders. Under no circumstances would she surrender without a fight. One way or another, she would destroy Edelgard for her treachery, and she would relish in every moment of it. Flame flinched at the intensity in Rhea's voice and looked down at the ground below like she wanted the stone floor of the cathedral to swallow her whole. Is it truly too late to prevent bloodshed, Lady Rhea? She asked softly. Edelgard must have her reasons for doing this. She didn't want to think ill of anyone if she could at all avoid it. She didn't want to think the invasion was out of the darkness of Edelgard's heart, especially since she had idolized the students of the Officers' Academy greatly when they were still taking classes there. Flame had been sadder than she wanted to admit when they were forced to split up. Even so, in Rhea's mind, there was no excuse that could possibly justify all of this. Edelgard had made her choice, and she would pay for it. If so, they elude me. The woman seems to consider our church's very existence an abomination. Yet she has gone to the trouble of reviving the Southern Church, which implies she does not mean to destroy the faith outright, Seath murmured under his breath. He had spent ages trying to find the truth behind why Edelgard had planned all of this, but he ran into different walls each time to keep the truth buried against his will. Perhaps Gareg Mach is the true prize she seeks. Or worse, this entire invasion could merely be a precursor to conquering all of Fodlan. Rhea thought about it for a few moments, but she realized instantly she couldn't waste time on this. As much as she wanted to understand Edelgard's intentions, if only to make the act of vengeance that much sweeter, she knew that would just eat up some of the sparingly few minutes she had to protect the monastery from invasion. Her purpose matters not. Our charge is to defend the monastery at all costs. I took an oath. I swore I would never again suffer the boots of thieves to sully this land. That's all. Edelgard was a thief. She wanted to take the monastery from the people who had held it for centuries upon centuries, and Rhea would not let it stand. If she could keep her home safe, then she would do it at any cost. Rhea. Seath started. He didn't know what to say to her at this point, not that there was much of anything that would make this easier for any of them. His words died out long before he could even think through them, and he looked up at the statue of the goddess towering them instead. It is a low form of comedy we find ourselves engaged in this day, Flame murmured as she took a step toward the statue for herself. To think the descendants of their empire will be the first to invade Gareg Mach. In days long gone, it would have been an absurd thing to suggest the descendants of the first emperor would become their greatest enemies. But times had changed, and Rhea had as well. All the more reason to prevent it. I care not if we shared blood countless generations ago. I will not permit anyone to defile Mother's resting place. The air remained silent as the three stared up at the goddess statue, hoping she would offer them some degree of peace or light in these trying times. She remained motionless, though, as they all knew she would. They would need to fight through this for themselves regardless of if they were ready or not. And the goddess only knew they never could be. Chapter 29, The Struggle Commences. Somehow, Gareg Mach was even more imposing when Shay returned. She could still remember how she had felt when she first saw the monastery, like it was yesterday. Her chest had filled with an overwhelming sense of wonder, and all she could do was stare for a lot longer than she wanted to admit. Back when she was first brought on as a student, being there at the monastery was the greatest honor she could have been granted. At Gareg Mach, she was safe, and she had known it. But now, Gareg Mach may have just been the least secure place on the entire continent. Shay stared up at the massive stone structure with a steady screaming in her chest and one hand on her sword. She wanted to believe this battle would be a simple one, but she knew that was too generous for her to imagine. This fight was bound to be difficult, the hardest one Shay had fought yet, and she had no idea how she was meant to prepare for it. Most of the other Black Eagles were gathered around Shay as well, with only Petra, Hubert, and Monica absent so they could check in with the rest of the soldiers. The anxiety in the air was palpable, so Shay decided to do the one thing she knew best, lightening the mood. Feels like it's been an eternity since I've seen the walls of Gareg Mach, she murmured. Dorothea, who was just off to Shay's right, let out a small sigh of shock and relief at the comment. Who knew we'd leave as students and return at the head of the Imperial Army? She asked next. None of them could have ever expected it, but this was the truth of their reality now, and whether they liked it or not, they would need to face it. Bernadetta, however, was nowhere near as eager to tackle the challenge the siege was bound to pose. Lady Rhea must be so angry at us. She cried out before her voice fell to a murmur only she could hear. Oh, why did I agree to come along? We'll be lucky if angry is as far as her feelings go on the subject, Edelgard remarked, and Bernadetta let out yet another anxious whine. I imagine she's apoplectic. Of course she is, Bernadetta muttered. Why in the world would anybody ever think this is a good idea? Attacking Gareg Mach is the surest way to end up dead, and if the Knights of Syros don't kill us, then Lady Rhea most certainly will. The Knights of Syros are bound to fight tooth and nail to stop us, Linhard confirmed, and Bernadetta held back a muted whimper. But their forces are currently divided between the Central Church and the Western Church. She nodded to herself at that. She didn't know much about the Central Church's authority over Fodlan on account of being raised in such a small pocket of Leicester, but she was fully aware of the conflict between Gareg Mach and the Western Church. She had heard whispers of the Western Church growing more violent as of late, and if Shay had to guess, she would assume they had been inspired by Adrestia deciding to actively rebel against Rhea's authority. The invasion on Gareg Mach would be partnered with yet another threat to the Central Church, and that would leave them weaker than ever. On top of that, the Central Church had never truly recovered from splitting its forces in multiple directions 2 years ago, and when all of that came together, it left Rhea at a greater disadvantage than ever before. Well, we've got teeth and we've got nails, so I don't care who we're facing, I'll brush 'em all aside. Caspar declared. As per usual, he was the most confident of the group, and Bernadetta clearly wished she shared his enthusiasm and passion. Instead, her fingers trembled where they held the bow she was set to be using in the battle ahead. While they may have a monastery to hole up in, we possess the superior numbers. Gareg Mach is well fortified, but not impregnable, Ferdinand said in an attempt to ease Bernadetta's fears, though it was clear all of them needed the extra vote of encouragement if they were to come out as the victors. None of them had ever seen such a large-scale invasion, much less been involved with one, so they needed all the extra pushes in the right direction. As much as Shay wanted to agree with Ferdinand heartily, she knew it wasn't going to be that simple. She didn't want to openly go against him either though, so she instead settled for something in between. We can't assume victory based on numbers alone. Anything could happen. So let's just be careful, Shay eventually concluded. She really wanted to believe the battle would end the way she was hoping, with an undisputed victory for the Black Eagles, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Rhea was bound to be a difficult opponent, and the Knights of Syros would only make the battle harder. Our goal is only to seize the monastery, not raze it to the ground, Edelgard reminded everyone. This is a strategic position best left in our hands. If we destroy it, then we will be at a great disadvantage in the future. Proceed carefully, and do not take any risks you believe to be unnecessary. Everyone nodded back their muted agreement, unable to muster the gusto with which Caspar and Ferdinand spoke. Shay was on the verge of saying something to try and lift their spirits, but she was cut off when Hubert, Petra, and Monica returned to the group. Upon a second glance, Shay realized Ladislava and Randolph were with them as well. If all 5 of them were back, then that likely meant the last few details of the invasion had been ironed out. All that was left was to actually set out and eliminate the enemy army once and for all. The soldiers are ready, Your Majesty, Ladislava declared firmly. We can begin the attack at once. The scouting is also finished. We know with certainty where the enemy will be positioning its soldiers, Petra said next. We owe this to Monica. She has incredible knowledge of this place and a perfect memory as well. Edelgard nodded at that. As usual, Monica, your talents are invaluable. I really didn't do much, Your Majesty. Monica began, but when she looked up and saw the Emperor's expression generally blank, her cheeks went slightly pink as she continued to speak. That is, ERM. It was truly an honor to assist you. Not to say I've finished helping you, of course. In fact, I am always at the ready. Shay would have thought she had gotten used to Monica's behavior by now given how long they had been fighting at one another's side and preparing for this day, but she never quite managed to push through the second-hand embarrassment that came with Monica trying to impress Edelgard. Luckily, the Emperor was either entirely oblivious to this behavior or had gotten used to it long ago to the point of not being bothered. Don't ever change, Monica. This is it then. We're really going to attack Gareg Mach, Bernadetta whispered, mercifully taking the attention away from Monica for a few seconds. I still can't believe we're actually here. I never thought we would make it this far. Of course we did, Hubert told her simply. This has always been the plan, and we shall see it through to the end regardless of what is to come next. I realize saying this might make the situation worse, but there's no need to be so nervous. If you act to the best of your abilities, all will be well, Edelgard declared, and Shay felt some of the tension in her shoulders start to thin out in favor of a rush of pure adrenaline. This was what she lived for, and now that she was on the verge of the battle, she could hardly wait. Now then, everyone. The time has come. The time to take Gareg Mach and reclaim Fodlan. A hearty cry of agreement rose up from the crowd, and Edelgard pointed her axe in the direction of the monastery. That was all it took for the Adrestian army to start its surge forward in pursuit of freedom and Gareg Mach. At long last, the moment had arrived. Shay summoned her sword of lava to her free hand before unsheathing her steel blade. All the while, Arvel let out an impressed hum from the back of her mind. Jumping straight into the maw of our enemies, eh? Oh, how exciting. Is this where I should talk about my heart racing? Shay let out a loose scoff. That might be the first time in our 2 years of partnership that I've ever heard you talk about your feelings, she remarked playfully. And it's instead about me going off to fight in a battle rather than anything you're doing directly. You can't fight without my power, so unless you want me to leave you high and dry in the biggest battle of your life, I would suggest shutting it, Arvel reminded her, and Shay resisted the urge to laugh if only for the sake of not being stared at by her comrades. For now, this is the day the monastery shall fall, and we will be massive instruments in its demise. Shay gripped a bit tighter at her sword of lava. I don't think I've ever been more ready for a battle in my life. Let's do it. The Knights of Syros had set up a defensive formation just within the monastery walls, Shay soon found out, and the first objective of the battle was to try to find a way to break it. As long as Rhea and Seath could lead their forces in a defensive battle, then they would have the upper hand since trying to claim a fortress was much harder than just trying to hold it, and Shay could feel the sting of that twist of tactics as she raised her blade and started to plow through the first bunch of Knights of Syros that were trying to rush her location. Leave the bulk of our forces near the front entrance, Edelgard instructed as she gestured for the rest of the Black Eagles to follow her. There are other ways of getting into the monastery, and we need to turn to those first and foremost. We need to curl around the back of the building and try to rush them from behind. Shay nodded as she followed the Black Eagles away from the main entrance of the monastery. She trusted this to be the best course of action if Edelgard was instructing her to leave the bulk of the army behind, and Shay wasn't going to question it. If there was another way into the monastery, then it was bound to be a bit easier to take than the front door. Shay had to wonder if perhaps there were any notable back entrances that would make this battle easier. She didn't know much about Gareg Mach in general, but she hoped with everything she had Edelgard was right about having an easier way to slip past the enemy forces. There had to be a way to break the defensive line, but it sure as hell wasn't going to come from breaking straight through the front entrance. There were more Knights of Syros than Shay could even hope to count trying to swarm around the Black Eagle strike force as they tried to make for a back entrance of the monastery, and the mercenary ducked beneath a slash before following up with an upward stab at the knight that dared to attack her. Most of the knights were waiting inside the monastery, but a small faction of them had been sent out to try and stop Edelgard directly. Rhea was being careful here, not daring to take any chances, and as admirable as that was from a tactical perspective, Shay didn't like having to be on the receiving end of it. By the time the group had arrived at one of the back entrances, Edelgard had already come up with another plan. The fact that she could find a way to think enough to come up with a concrete plan amidst the chaos was impressive to Shay, but she did not voice her thoughts. Instead, she just looked over to her emperor and waited for her instructions. We'll start on the lower level and work our way up, taking control of the walls. Split into groups and take those strongholds. Edelgard instructed. She didn't wait for anyone to follow her before she dashed off toward one of the two nearest strongholds, trusting the other Black Eagles to understand how to split themselves up without her directions. Shay started off toward the same stronghold as Edelgard with Hubert and Monica trailing after her. Bernadetta rounded off their group while Ferdinand led Petra, Dorothea, Caspar, and Linhard in the opposite direction. Hubert turned to the rest of the group around him and let out a thin sigh. The enemy is desperate, and will most likely dispatch troops to recapture any strongholds we seize. Be on your guard and eliminate any follow-up soldiers that appear. Shay nodded. She couldn't say she was surprised by the idea of Rhea intending to follow up on every stronghold that may have been taken out from under her feet, but it was irritating regardless. There wasn't much Shay could do about it though, so she gripped her swords a little bit tighter and followed Edelgard into the heart of the nearby stronghold. Much to Shay's surprise though, there was someone standing at the heart of the chaos who didn't seem anything like the regular commanders of the Knights of Syros. The woman had blonde hair that curled near her cheeks and shoulders, and a tome was pressed firmly into her left hand. She barely seemed to be paying attention to the battle around her, instead mumbling something under her breath. Shay had to wonder if the woman had a death wish, and given the circumstances, she theorized that was actually an option. Edelgard slid to a stop when she saw the blonde woman though, and her eyes went wide. "Constance?" she asked. The blonde woman looked up, and Edelgard's eyes narrowed in a mix of confusion and dissatisfaction. "What are you doing here?" The woman, seemingly named Constance, stared at Edelgard with a dropped jaw for a long moment, processing what she was seeing to the best of her ability, before she managed to get a grip on herself once again. "I was unlucky enough to be nearby when the church had need of fighters." "I beg your forgiveness, your majesty," Constance said. She looked down once again, seemingly trying to convince herself to raise her tome for the sake of the battle ahead. The other soldiers didn't bother to wait for Constance's cue though. Instead, the Knights of Syros surged toward the group around Edelgard, all their weapons at the ready. Shay slashed her blades in a wide arc, catching 6 soldiers off guard and sending them stumbling. Monica followed up with an ice attack that took 3 of them out of the battle while Bernadetta fired arrows at the remaining 3 with surprising swiftness. Hubert sent out a blast of dark magic at the soldiers just off to Constance's right, and Shay finished them off with a set of swift sword slashes. Edelgard, meanwhile, approached Constance, and the two spoke in the sole pocket of peace among the chaos. "If you don't want to fight for the church, then you don't need to," Edelgard pointed out. "Don't throw your life away fighting for a cause you don't believe in, Constance. There is a place for you here in the Imperial Army so long as you are willing to take it." Constance hesitated for a long time, glancing between Edelgard and the rest of the soldiers that surrounded them. Eventually, she forced herself to nod, taking Edelgard's outstretched hand in her own. "I shall stand at your side to the end," she agreed. "My sincerest apologies for daring to fight you in the first place. I shall accept any punishment you see fit." Edelgard hesitated at that but ultimately shook it off. "There will be no punishment. As long as you help us to claim the monastery, we can consider all of this in the past. Though I would like to hear an explanation later as to why you were fighting on the same side as the church in the first place. Does that sound like a suitable deal?" "Of course," Constance nodded. "I certainly would not have done this willingly. Though it matters little now. I shall fight with you from this point forward. My magic will be at your command. Then we start with fighting through the enemies stationed in this stronghold," Edelgard told her. "After that, you can tell me anything else you know about the enemy's current arrangements. We would greatly appreciate the insight given how little we know of their current plans." Constance's eyes went wide at that. Happy. She should be fighting elsewhere in the monastery, she remembered. Edelgard seemed confused at the mention of this happy character, but Constance did her best to fill in the gaps. "She is a dear friend of mine, and she is fighting on the side of the church as well. I have no doubt she would be willing to join your forces as well. She has never been fond of the knights or church." "Then we'll be certain to keep an eye out for her," Edelgard nodded. "In the meantime, we need to claim this stronghold and push up through the higher levels of the monastery. The longer this battle drags on, the more time Rhea has to plan her next move, and we cannot allow her the chance." Constance nodded, and she cast a quick fire spell before Edelgard had the chance to tell her in full what their goal was set to be. Shay slashed at a handful of enemies that dared to stray too close in her direction after being knocked astray by Constance's explosion of flames. Hubert was happy to help her finish the job, and Bernadetta took care of a few other knights with her arrows. By this point, the stronghold had already been at least halfway cleared out, and Shay couldn't help but be relieved by just how much they had managed to accomplish in such a short period of time. She never would have thought this to be so simple given how strong the Knights of Syros were, and while it wasn't entirely effortless to defeat them, she was having an easier her foes than she would have expected. Even with Edelgard distracted for a few minutes while talking to Constance, the others in her group had managed to clear out most of the knights without breaking a sweat. I have to wonder how Edelgard knows this Constance character, Arvel remarked from the back of Shay's mind. With the way they were talking, it seems like they're old friends of some kind, though I doubt we'll be let in fully on the depths of their relationship until after we can win this battle. Now is hardly the time for an explanation, and the two of them were lucky enough to be able to talk at all with everything going on. Shay nodded, though she kept the motion subtle to ensure no one else caught on to her being distracted. That was another conversation she didn't want to have in the middle of a fight, though ideally, she would never need to talk about it at all. Arvel had decided to keep themselves secret, and she respected that. As long as they could continue to work together as partners in destiny and destroyers of the battlefield, Shay was fine with Arvel's desires of secrecy. Shay didn't need to worry about being distracted at all, as a matter of fact. The stronghold was cleared out almost entirely in a matter of seconds after Arvel finished speaking to her. The mercenary took in a small breath, one of the few she knew she would be allowed to enjoy in peace until the battle ended, before turning to Edelgard. "We should keep heading up through the monastery, right?" she asked. "The others should be able to take care of the other stronghold on this level." Edelgard nodded. "I have no doubt they can handle themselves, and we need to trust them. Right now, the rest of the monastery awaits, and we can proceed to try and claim it for ourselves," she said. She didn't bother telling Shay that she would formally introduce her to Constance after the battle ended, instead knowing that as a given. Constance didn't ask for introductions either, instead just adjusting her grip on the tome in her hands to ensure she was prepared for the next onslaught. "Onward we go then," Arvel told Shay. "Let's see how long the enemy can outlast us when we're up close and personal." Ferdinand's group wasted no time in surging toward the second stronghold on the ground level of the monastery. There were more knights than Ferdinand had ever seen in his life gathered together in the base, but he refused to let that stop him. He was here to seize the monastery, and he couldn't let the ground forces be the ones to get in his way. Edelgard was counting on him, and he would ensure he was reliable to her and the rest of their army. Caspar swung his axe in a grand arc to send many soldiers flying, offering the perfect opening for Dorothea and Linhard to strike the fighters down with their fire and wind magic respectively. Petra was little more than a flash in Ferdinand's peripheral vision, darting between the enemy knights with her blade ever at the ready. As long as she was keeping herself safe, it was fine. She knew how to handle herself in a battle, and she was proving it loud and clear already. Caspar slashed his axe sideways once again, and when Ferdinand prepared to lunge forward with his spear at the ready, he was met with an unexpected sight. There was a young woman standing behind the soldiers, clearly trying to hide for the sake of slipping away in the midst of the chaos. She had a tome raised above her head to try and deflect any blows aimed to kill, but she slowly lowered the tome when she realized her cover had been blown. Even so, she didn't open it to try and strike at the Imperial forces, instead just staring straight at them with a defeated frown etched on her face. The young woman had bright scarlet hair tinged with pink, and she watched Ferdinand warily as she raised her free hand in surrender. "I'm not here to start a fight. I didn't even want to be here in the first place. If you want me to back down, then consider it done," she told him. Ferdinand didn't think he had ever been quite so mystified before that moment, so for a long time, all it felt like he could do was stare at the strange woman. He had expected many things from this battle, but someone willing to surrender had certainly not fit the ideas he had set up for the fight in his mind. He would have thought every person fighting with the church was ready to lay down their lives for the sake of their cause. In fact, Ferdinand had been confident he would end up fighting everyone to the death that day. But there the woman was, staring at him and waiting for him to either deal the finishing blow or agree to let her leave the battlefield with her life. Linhard was the first one to react rather than Ferdinand, and he sent out a massive blast of magic before approaching the woman. "If you know how to fight and don't want to side with the church, then you should just join us. It will certainly save us the hassle of having to fight you," he pointed out. With that, he went back to fighting, not bothering to wait to see how the woman responded. She thought about it for a moment before humming. "It sure beats dying here," she agreed before looking over to Ferdinand. "Can I trust you to not cut my head off when I turn my back?" Ferdinand finally snapped out of his daze at that, and he nodded before he could say with certainty how he really felt about all of this. Still, it wasn't a decision he could make in good conscience. Ferdinand barely knew her, and if he wanted to come up with a conclusive decision for what to do next, then he would have to speak with some combination of Edelgard, Hubert, and Monica about it first. If she was surrendering without a fight though, then who was he to object or complain? "All right," Ferdinand nodded. "We're aiming to take the monastery, and if you can fight, then you can join our side of the battle." He wanted to believe she was telling the truth, that she was someone to be trusted, but a small part of his mind that had started to thrive following his father's arrest wondered if perhaps she was a traitor meant to stab all of them in the back. Ferdinand didn't want to believe that part of his brain was correct, but he knew better than to trust without thinking it through first either. That was a recipe for disaster, and he knew the odds of this battle were grim enough even without his interference. If the woman was planning on stabbing them in the back though, she certainly didn't do it right away. Instead, she just nodded and opened her tome before starting to cast a set of dark charms on the nearby soldiers. Ferdinand was halfway tempted to ask for her name, but he was quickly distracted by another set of knights trying to strike him directly. He redirected his focus to his spear to fend them off as Dorothea and Petra cleared out the remaining soldiers. Just like that, the stronghold was theirs. "We proceed up through the monastery," Ferdinand declared as he adjusted the reins on his steed with his free hand. "We can rendezvous with the other group when we've cleared out the lower levels. We should leave a few of our other soldiers behind to look after the stronghold to ensure the enemy doesn't try to reclaim it," Linhard pointed out. That was his way of saying he knew it was just a matter of time before Rhea sent someone out to try and claim their strongholds from behind. If they couldn't outright prevent it though, then they could at least try to fend off the enemy forces before they struck. Ferdinand nodded, and he was on the verge of commanding a few of the Imperial soldiers to look after the stronghold while he pressed on with the Black Eagles when he heard a battle cry pierce the air overhead. He looked up and saw a squadron of Pegasus Knights descending from above, and he could figure out their aims without even needing to ask. Rhea had already deployed her reinforcements to try and stop the Black Eagles while they were separated between the two strongholds. She didn't intend to go down without a fight, and this was just the beginning. Linhard was quick to dispose of a few of the Pegasus riders though, sending out a blast of wind magic that shook the air and knocked the knights off their mounts. Ferdinand forced himself to look away from the Pegasus Knights that had been left injured by Linhard's attack as he braced his spear for another attack. He had to wait until the enemies were within his range before he could attack, so in the meantime, he watched as the others continued to fire down attacks from the sky to ensure they were able to proceed as soon as possible. The woman sent out a few dark blasts as well, releasing black blades into the air that slashed mercilessly at her foes. After she finished with her first onslaught, she turned to look at Ferdinand. "After this, I want to help my friend," she told him. She was forced to fight by the church too. Upon seeing just how shocked and confused Ferdinand looked, she shook her head. "Long story. My name is Happy though. We can cover the finer details later. For now, I can tell you a bit more about what the knights have planned for you. I bet you're going to want to hear that." Ferdinand nodded, not wanting to push Happy too hard given how stressed she already seemed to be. She barely believed she had been spared, and her features were knotted with tension as she prepared another spell. She was right about Ferdinand needing to hear what the Knights of Syros had up their sleeves though, and he was beyond glad to have an informant there to help him proceed. Once again, a piece of his mind nagged at him that he was trusting too freely, that he would come to regret this, but he forced his brain into silence. There was too much for him to handle before he could worry about treachery. He would have time to discuss Happy with the others later. For the moment, the rest of the battle waited for him. They had made good progress up to that point, but the rest of the monastery would not fall quite so easily. Ferdinand just hoped they were able to claim Gareg Mach and escape in one piece. It was all he could ask for at this point. Chapter 30, The Fall Draws Near. Pushing on through the lower levels of the monastery was far easier than Shay had expected it to be. She was not complaining about that by any stretch of the imagination, of course, but she was still pleasantly surprised by how easily she cut through every knight of Ceros that came her way. Fighting as a team certainly made it easier to claim victory, and pressing through the monastery with the Black Eagles prompted Shay to finally notice just how strong they were as a group. When they put their attention together, they could do just about anything, and nobody could stand in their way. Shay slashed her blades outward in an X-shaped motion, cutting at least 4 enemy soldiers in the crossfire and sending them flying backward. Her friends were quick to follow up on the attack from behind her while she moved on to take down the other knights of Ceros that dared to stray just a little bit too close to her. The thrill of the fight had Shay standing atop a mountain of adrenaline, and she couldn't have been happier for it. She didn't think she had been involved with a more thrilling fight in ages, and she was looking forward to seeing where it took her from there. A flash of orange appeared through the crowd, and Shay recognized the color as being Ferdinand's hair. The other group had succeeded in fighting through the first stronghold, not that she was surprised. They knew how to handle themselves well as a team, and they wouldn't back down no matter what happened. Significantly less expected was the blast of dark magic that followed Shay's first glimpse of Ferdinand's hair, and the mercenary couldn't help frowning with a hum to herself. She didn't think anyone in the other group could use dark magic. The other Black Eagles tended to stray towards different elements as their primary affinities. Hubert was the only one who used only dark magic, and he was with her. Soon enough, Shay had her answer for who was responsible for it. There was a woman Shay didn't recognize with the other group of the Black Eagles, her hair a bright pink color that easily caught everyone's attention. She had a tome in one hand, and she cast 3 spells in quick succession before ducking beneath an attack that came swinging straight for her head. Ferdinand was quick to follow upon the soldier that tried to kill her with a strike of his own, and she sent him a grateful nod. "Happy?" Constance cried out from behind Shay. Her voice was far louder now compared to how it had been during the earlier stages of the battle, but the mercenary couldn't figure out why for the life of her. Come to think of it, Constance had started to fight with more energy soon after she had been recruited, but once again, Shay couldn't figure out the reason for the shift. It was something she could ask later on once she was comfortable with being around Constance enough to talk to her openly. Speculating in the meantime wouldn't get her anywhere. The woman beside Ferdinand looked up at the sound of Constance's yell, and Shay could only assume she had responded because Constance had called out her name. It was the best explanation she had for the moment, so she decided to go along with it until she was given reason to believe otherwise. "Coco!" Happy exclaimed before she started to weave her way through the enemy ranks to reunite with Constance. Both of them attacked each knight they passed with everything they had, and Shay figured out fairly quickly that the two of them had been fighting together for a long time. There was no other explanation she could think of for how the two of them had come to fall into a rhythm like this so effortlessly. "I'm so happy to see you're all right," Constance exclaimed as she slid to a stop beside Happy. "I was so worried when we were separated earlier. I'm glad you decided to change sides. I think this place will suit our skills much better. As well as our current allegiances." Shay blinked a few times in response to Constance's words. To be more accurate, she was shocked at just how the words had been said, and it was enough to make her pause in her swordplay to look over at Constance with wide eyes and a dropped jaw. She hadn't been imagining it. Constance's demeanor had changed almost completely since she had first joined the army. The way she carried herself was completely different now, and while Shay knew she couldn't just stare in the middle of a fight like this, it was certainly tempting. She didn't think she had ever heard someone completely change in the blink of an eye like that, and she was going to have to ask more questions about it when she got the chance. "I agree," Happy nodded, not at all bothered by Constance's shift in demeanor. Then again, she hadn't seen how Constance had been behaving before, so it was fully possible she hadn't noticed. Maybe she was used to this given the fact that she and Constance seemed to know one another. No, they definitely did. Constance had mentioned her before when she first joined up with the Black Eagles. That was again a question for later on though, so Shay forced herself to focus on the battle again despite how tempting it was to try and listen in on Constance and Happy's conversation to figure out just what was happening with the former. "We've managed to break through the front-line strongholds," Ferdinand said as Shay dragged herself back to focusing on the battle at hand. He had come to reunite with Edelgard nearby, and the two fought with an incredible sense of bravado Shay knew came with their strange rivalry. She had never asked too many questions about it, and she was glad for that now. As long as it helped Edelgard and Ferdinand to fight a little bit better, she would take it. "Good work," Edelgard told Ferdinand. "We can stay together from here and press up through the monastery. There will no doubt be reinforcements coming after us soon enough, but right now, we need to focus on simply pushing forward. We can deal with the reinforcements with time. There should be enough soldiers back at the first few strongholds to keep us from needing to send anyone back to defend them," Hubert remarked as he fell into pace alongside Ferdinand and Edelgard. "Ladislava and Rudolf can handle the rest of the defense portion of this mission. We can focus only on moving forward." Monica nodded, but before she had the chance to offer supplementary information about Hubert's words, a bolt of white lightning slammed into the ground just beside her. Monica barely managed to avoid the attack, but the force of the lightning coming so close to her sent her tumbling backward. Dorothea barely managed to catch her before she hit the ground, and Monica offered her a grateful nod with a thin layer of pink dusting at her cheeks before she returned her attention to the battle again in full. "What in the world was that?" Caspar yelled in shock. He was swinging his axe in a wide arc when the attack hit, and he had seen nothing but the flash of white in his peripheral vision followed by Monica falling. Before he had the chance to try and put the pieces together though, another blast of white lightning appeared, but this time, it targeted him. The lightning was deflected at the last moment by a blast of wind magic from Linhard, and Caspar hissed as he brushed off his left arm which had come the closest to getting hit. "I take it the priests in the church have decided where their loyalties lie," Edelgard remarked as she looked up to the higher levels of the monastery. "This appears to be some type of light magic. I cannot say I'm surprised they decided to employ this strategy. So they're going to try and fire down on us until we either leave or die. Is that it?" Shay asked, not bothering with graceful wording as she avoided a blast of lightning and then a lance stab. She pushed forward after the fact, slashing both of her blades through the air before an axe-wielding foe could try to bring her down. "There needs to be a caster around here," Monica declared. "This magic takes concentration and large numbers of people to cast. Someone has to be leading them through it, and if we can fight off the person responsible for the spell, then we should be able to stop the onslaught." "I believe the one responsible for this is close by as well," Hubert agreed. "If we keep moving forward, we should run into the person behind it soon enough. All we need to do is maintain our bearings in the meantime. Then we keep moving," Edelgard concluded. She gestured for the others to continue following her before dashing through the enemy forces. The soldiers were left staggering backward from the force of her pushing through with her shield. As per usual, Edelgard's strength was immense and something to be admired. Shay had known that ever since they first met, but Edelgard still seemed to find new ways to impress her. That was one of many reasons Shay fought for her now, and the battle was only solidifying how good a decision that had been 2 years ago. The path up through the monastery was grand and offered a lot of room to move around in, though that space was not just for the Black Eagles to take advantage of. The enemy forces were more than happy to take advantage of their added morale from being in their own territory, and a massive force of sword-wielders came rushing toward the Black Eagles with battle cries that echoed through the air. They were trying to restrict the Black Eagles' ability to fight back or run since none of them had the advantage of being in the air. It was an admirable goal and a sound tactic. Or, at the very least, it would have been if not for Edelgard holding up her shield to block each sword strike that came her way. Ferdinand twisted his lance sideways to deflect the other attacks coming his way before lunging forward. Behind him, Bernadetta knocked arrows on her bow and released them into the crowd, not bothering to wait and see if any of them hit their targets. Constance and Happy were fighting in their perfect rhythm once again, casting fire and dark spells that bounced off one another damn near perfectly. While the group was primarily concerned with the infantry coming their way, another brigade of Pegasus Knights had arrived in the overhead skies, and they were pressing down with incredible speed and strength. It was clear they were hoping to trap the Black Eagles between two larger battalions to eventually wear down their strength. Once again, it would have been a sound strategy if not for the fact that the Black Eagles had been working together for 2 years now. Even in times when they were separated, their camaraderie was remembered, and coming to fight alongside one another again was beyond simple for them. This was just a natural part of living for them even if they hadn't practiced fighting as a team in ages. Edelgard nodded to Monica before swiftly trading places with her so she could deflect the lance attacks coming down from above. The mage instead turned her attention to the foot soldiers gathered in the other direction, trapping some of them in sheets of ice and hitting others with flares of light magic. Hubert gladly joined her endeavor, and the two of them put their previous squabbles aside for the sake of fighting in harmony. The two didn't get along often, but when they did, everything seemed to fall right into place in terms of their combat abilities. They needed added defense though, so Shay darted between them before making herself into a human shield for them both. She could handle sword attacks far better than the mages, and she needed to be at close range to counter-attack anyway. The Black Eagles truly fought like a well-oiled machine, and Shay didn't think she had ever been prouder to be a part of a team for combat. Edelgard, meanwhile, held up her shield to block the various lance strikes coming in her direction. Since she was the leader of the invading army and the ruler of Adrestia, she was the main target of any attacking forces. That did not make her an easy target though, and when some of the enemy Pegasus Knights were sent staggering by her fierce blocking tactics, she raised her axe and brought it down with enough force to break their weapons in two. Edelgard didn't stop there either, and she twirled her axe around before slashing 3 Pegasus Knights back at once. The soldiers who were smart enough to not target Edelgard were quickly taken out of the picture by Bernadetta and Linhard. Bernadetta was raining down arrows as per usual, and Linhard matched her energy by sending out blasts of wind magic out to stagger the flight paths of the Pegasi. Shay had never known Pegasi and wyverns were weak to wind magic until she met Linhard, but she was beyond glad they were now. It certainly made all of their lives a lot easier. By the time both the infantry battalion and Pegasus Knight Brigade had been cleared out, Shay was panting heavily, and sweat was lining her forehead. She was tired, but that didn't mean she was finished. There was still a hell of a lot more fight in her, and she would press on no matter what. Until the monastery was theirs, they could not back down. Shay took this brief moment of peace to look around the area and see if she could figure out who was responsible for the barrage of white lightning that continued to rain around the Black Eagles. The magic came dangerously close to striking a few of them directly when they didn't have the haze of battle to defend them, but they were able to get out of the way just in time when the lightning threatened to send them flying. They were close to the source of it. They just had to be. Shay didn't know much about magic, but she knew enough to be confident the caster had to be close by to summon this much power at once. Soon enough, Shay's gaze fell on the entrance to a nearby stronghold, and when she squinted, she could make out a mass of white waiting inside. Priests wore white, and they were the only ones who wouldn't opt for armor in the middle of a battle. They had to be the ones behind all of this. If the casters were higher up in the monastery, then they would have had better aim and would have at least hit one of the Black Eagles directly by now. Come on. I found them. Shay declared to the Black Eagles. She didn't bother waiting to watch if the others would follow her, instead trusting they would no matter what. Shay took off running as soon as she could, letting the pounding of her feet against the stones below ground her. This was what she lived for, and she wouldn't surrender no matter what. Well, I suppose I can't fault them for trying, at the very least, Arvel hummed. If they want to make this a long, protracted battle, then so be it. At least we can proceed knowing we gave them the chance to surrender. Somehow, Arvel's words only made Shay's resolve to win the battle even stronger, and she hadn't even thought such a thing was possible. Before she knew it, the world around her seemed to distort under her excitement and adrenaline. Shay darted forward faster than she ever had before, and the world blurred around her as her feet left the ground. A few seconds after taking off, Shay staggered, staring down at her body as she forced herself to come out of the haze. She landed. She didn't even remember jumping up in the first place, so what had just happened? Shay was vaguely aware of the others staring at her with confusion written all over their faces, but she shook it off as soon as she was able. This wasn't a time to get distracted. Even if she was almost certain she had just discovered yet another strange ability she and Arvel shared. That was the only explanation she could think of, at the very least. She would have to try and learn more about their new power soon enough. The heat of the moment in a battle was far from the right time though, so it would simply have to wait. Like every other strange ability she had discovered she had over the last few years, she would need to master its power in order to grow stronger, and if this ability was what she thought it was, running fast enough to start transforming into something else, then it was no doubt an extra benefit she wanted to have on her side. Shay had gotten so caught up in her own shock and awe over her new ability that she had almost forgotten what she was meant to be doing in the first place. That was right. She needed to concentrate her attention on defeating the enemies casting the lightning. She had accidentally dodged no fewer than 3 attacks of white magic coming down from above when she transformed, so even if she didn't know what was going on, she at least owed her extra abilities a bit of thanks for helping her out of the bind. Shay came to a stop inside the stronghold where the mages summoning the lightning were standing together. Around her, the rest of the Black Eagles fell into formation in preparation for a battle. To the credit of the priests, they at least managed to maintain their positions even when faced with the battalion that had already torn through half the monastery in their search of conquest and victory. They were bold at the very least, and Shay had to give them a little bit of praise for that much. Granted, it wouldn't save them, but it would at least count for something. At the front of the group of mages was none other than Flame. She glared at the Black Eagles with all the rage her small form could handle. "I must do everything in my power to stop this," she declared. With that, she raised her hand once again, and a bolt of lightning came crashing down just in front of Shay. The mercenary rolled out of the way at the last second, but she still felt the strength of the blast brush against her cheek as a complementary blade of wind. Flame handled herself oddly well in a fight. Had she not been in the middle of a battle herself, Shay would have wondered just how Flame had managed to gather such experience despite seeming so isolated from the rest of the world. "We will give you the chance to surrender as we have with all others," Edelgard told Flame carefully. Even so, her grip on her axe was tight with the promise of an attack on the tip of her blade. "You can run now or fight. The choice is yours." Flame's eyes narrowed with determination and darkness. "I will never back down. Not for those who wish to destroy my home." With that, she pointed her hand forward once again, and an explosion of light rocked the ground just in front of the Black Eagles. Edelgard held up her shield to deflect the brunt of the attack, but she was sent sliding backwards from the force of the explosion. Behind her, the rest of the Black Eagles scattered to clear out the stronghold as soon as possible, starting with the sages that continued to send lightning flying in their direction. Shay dodged 3 strikes of magic that came her direction, rolling low before she came up with a sudden slash attack. Inwardly, she couldn't help but wish she had already figured out how to use that transformative ability she had discovered earlier in the battle. It certainly would have made her life a lot easier when she was being forced to dodge so many attacks. There was nothing she could do about it now though, so she simply turned her attention to the task at hand, striking against each priest that dared to fire an attack in her direction. Their physical defenses were weak, all of their attention having gone to magical fortitude, so it didn't take much for Shay to send them to the ground. That was fine with her. The sooner she could take care of the enemy soldiers, the sooner she could press on through the upper levels of the monastery. Shay was so focused on the priests that she didn't realize another attack was coming for her neck until the wind pounded to indicate another battalion was descending upon the Black Eagles from above. Her eyes went wide, and she rolled out of the way at the last possible second. She heard the axe behind her whistle as it struck the place where she had been standing a few seconds prior. Shay was left off balance and breathing heavily, sweat beading down her cheeks, as she forced herself to look up and see just who had been responsible for the attack. It took Shay a moment to remember his name after she saw him. Cyril. That was it. The two of them hadn't talked much when she was at the monastery for a variety of reasons, but she had seen him around a few times. It appeared that like everyone else who lived at Gareg Mach, he intended to defend the place with his life no matter what that meant for him. He was riding a wyvern now, and his axe glistened dangerously in the sunshine. He didn't seem to care at all about following up on Shay's escape from his earlier strike though. Instead, he looked over to Flame and lowered his mount to the ground. "Seath sent me to get you," he told Flame. "He's worried, and he doesn't want you to sacrifice your life today. We should get out of here. He's going to want to talk to you as soon as possible." The conflict across Flame's face was clear, and she bit down on her lip as she glanced back and forth between Cyril and the rest of the battle unfolding before her. She wanted to stay more than anything, to defend her home from those who would threaten it, but she knew Cyril was right about her needing to retreat. She slowly but surely let her arms fall back down to her side, her previous spell left to disperse immediately, before she mounted the wyvern just behind Cyril. "I do not feel good about this," she whispered, her voice just barely loud enough for him to hear despite her lips being just behind his ear. Cyril sighed and shook his head. "I don't either," he confessed. He didn't let his reservations about the battle hold him back though, and he urged his wyvern to take off into the sky a few moments later. His mount followed his wishes, beating its wings against the sky with enough force to stagger the majority of the black eagles. They were left with no choice but to simply look up at Cyril as he retreated. Linhard nearly cast a wind spell in their direction, but by the time he was able to ready himself from the previous indirect attack sent by Cyril's wyvern, it was already too late. Flane and Cyril were already well out of his range, and they vanished on the horizon. Shay did her best to ignore their departure from the battlefield. Even though she always claimed it didn't bother her to fight a familiar face, it wasn't always that simple. She preferred to not have to fight them if she could at all get away with it. There was more to it than that though. As a mercenary, she needed to be ready to fight anyone who dared to stand in her way regardless of who they were or where their loyalties rested. She needed to be prepared for a battle against each and every person she had ever met. She had come to terms with that reality long ago. That didn't mean Shay liked fighting against people she knew though. In fact, she very much didn't like it, but she would never say that out loud. It was part of her job to not put the quiet part to words. It was a bad idea, and it would just put her in danger in the long run. As Shay watched Flane and Cyril depart, she couldn't help but be relieved to see them go. They were too young for this. Shay didn't know exactly how old either one of them was, but she knew well enough at a first glance that they were children, and she wasn't going to put them in danger if she could avoid it. The two of them retreating was the best option. After all, the Black Eagle's fight was with Rhea, and the others who stood in her way would only be a distraction. They needed to press on through the monastery as soon as possible so they could reach her without any other distractions. Shay shook off her thoughts about Flane and Cyril's retreat though, instead returning to the battle against the priests that lined the stronghold she and the rest of her allies currently stood in. She slashed her twin swords outward, cutting at least half a dozen enemy mages off guard in the midst of their attacks. That was enough of a distraction for Shay to follow up on attacking half of them while leaving the other three for her allies to take care of. She couldn't take all the fun, after all. Experience was gained in the heat of battle, and Shay already had enough of it. The Black Eagles were well on their way to catching up to her, but it would take time. She couldn't cut them off from that growth prematurely. It wouldn't sit well with her. While Shay was concentrating on taking out the three priests she had previously attacked, the others around her were focusing their attention on finishing off the last few mages left in the stronghold. Even with the interruption and distraction from Cyril, they had managed to clear out the stronghold fairly quickly, and it would act as the perfect foothold for them to take advantage of moving forward. By now, at least half the monastery was under their control. They had come a long way in such a short period of time, and Shay couldn't help but glow with pride at the thought of all they had accomplished already. "That takes care of that," Casper declared as he twirled his axe for a finishing move. "Now that we're finished with things in here, we can keep going through the monastery. We should be able to look forward to fighting Lady Rhea on one of the upper levels." "I don't think any of us will be looking forward to fighting Lady Rhea," Bernadetta corrected. "She's going to want all of us dead for what we've done today. I guess we're just going to have to deal with that no matter what." "Such is what we have agreed to do here today," Edelgard confirmed. "Still, we've made it this far, and we can't afford to back down. The monastery will be ours one way or another. There is nothing Rhea can do to stop us after how far we've come already." "I'm ready for whatever she throws at us," Shay declared with a bright grin on her face. She barely felt tired even after everything the battle had thrown at her before now. If anything, it was thrilling to be able to face a challenge like this after focusing on nothing more than training for so long. She liked being able to push her limits a bit, and this fight had certainly given her the room to do that. "I'm glad to hear it," Edelgard nodded. She didn't bother with telling Shay to back off in case they wound up running into something far worse than they could have imagined, instead trusting that idea to have already been made clear in the minds of all the Black Eagles. They were already thinking about how horribly this could end, and entertaining those ideas would only make it harder for them to claim success. Hope was what they needed most, and Edelgard was happy to offer it in her own way. Shay took in another sharp breath to keep herself grounded before she started pressing on through the next hall of the monastery. She ignored how familiar this place was to her, instead concentrating only on putting one foot in front of the other. It would be familiar to her again after all of this ended and the Black Eagles were able to set themselves up in those walls. That would be the time to indulge in nostalgia. Beyond that, it was something to look forward to, and Shay was more than happy to enjoy the luxury of optimism for as long as possible. It would help her to fight better, and it would no doubt rub off on the other Black Eagles too. No matter how long this battle was, it would end in victory. She was sure of it. Check the description for the links to the author.